and that the aid cut simply deepens mistrust, damages our moral standing and undermines our COP presidency.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman has raised two issues. One in terms of vaccines. He will know that we now have an offer open so that any accredited delegates who are not able to get vaccinated in their home country are able to receive vaccinations through the programme that we're setting up. And secondly, I can tell him that there is huge appreciation for the UK's leadership on climate action around the world, and that's based on conversations that I have day in, day out with world leaders.
Mr. Speaker, I think he knows that world leaders and others are saying to him, why is the UK the only G7 country to be cutting aid spending in the year we're hosting the COP? And the President knows that delivering support to developing countries is not just morally right, but is essential to building a coalition to pressure the world's largest emitters. Now, the most significant of these is China. To have a chance of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees, we need China to ensure its emissions peak and start to decline by 2025 at the latest. Does he agree? And if he does, can he tell us what the Prime Minister is actually doing to engage directly with China on this issue and persuade them to step up?
Mr. Speaker, we are engaged with all big emitters, and as he knows, I'm travelling around the globe talking to different countries. I just want to come back on his point about aid spending. Just point out that this year we will spend more on aid as a percentage of our GNI than any of either the US, Japan, Canada or indeed Italy.
Right, we now come to Philip Holloway.
In contrast to Kettering, which generates enough renewable electricity locally to power all 45,000 homes in the constituency, this week the Sun Yat-sen University in Guangzhou, China, reported that 52% of the world's urban greenhouse gas emissions come from just 25 megacities, 23 of which are in China. Will the President be focusing on this at COP26?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises a very important point, and that is precisely why, as part of the work that we are doing, we are aiming to support countries to make a clean energy transition to solar, to wind power, indeed other renewables.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the President join me in congratulating the Mayor of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, Dr Nick Johnson, for pressing ahead resolutely with the recommendations of the Independent Climate Commission established by his predecessor, chaired by Baroness Brown? Fantastic example of what can be done locally in the run-up to COP26.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I congratulate all local areas and local leaders who are doing their bit in terms of climate action. As I said, we are today launching the local authorities and mayors engagement pack, and I hope local authorities and mayors will use that to encourage climate action across their areas.
Mr. Speaker, cleaning up our air, both here and across the globe, is a major challenge for all of us. The conversations I'm having with local people and businesses in the cities of London and Westminster make it clear that we have a key opportunity at COP26 for the UK to become a global leader in promoting cleaner, greener urban environments. With this in mind, can my right honourable friend confirm that he will do all he can to accelerate action to tackle urban air pollution through collaboration between governments, businesses and civil society?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is already leading the way on tackling air pollution. Government is backing a £3.8 billion plan to clean up transport and tackle air pollution, investing in green transport and working with local authorities just like the City of Westminster. My honourable friend will be keen to read the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which is being published later today, which will set out a world-first green print for decarbonised transport and clean air.
Let's go to Christina Rees. Christina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I ask the President what proportion of the billions of pounds of private sector investment and how many of the 250,000 highly skilled green jobs contained in the Prime Minister's 10-point Green Industrial Revolution plan to level up across the UK will go to Wales?
Mr. Speaker, we are supporting industrial clusters around the world, as you will know from the 10-point plan that the Prime Minister published at the end of last year, and we are seeing action across the country. You will know that the government has recently funded some new offshore wind ports, and of course you've seen the investment that's going into battery manufacturing for electric vehicles.
Final question, Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's real concern regarding the UK Government's accommodation provider for COP26 MCI groups, extremely high costs and unreasonable terms and conditions. Will the President be providing details of the MCI contract to the committee scrutinising COP, and can he assure us that delegations, many of which operate on very small budgets and are among the worst affected by climate change, will not be deterred from attending the conference?
President Sharma.
Mr. Speaker, I would just point out to him that in terms of MCI, it has only secured around a third of the market availability for hotel rooms, and there are alternative options for booking accommodation which are still available. If he has specific issues, I'll be happy to speak to him separately.
That was the final question. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like to point out the British Sign Language interpretation of proceedings is available to watch on parliamentlive.tv. We now come to questions to the Prime Minister, and we're going to start those questions with Andy Slaughter.
Question number one,
Mr. Speaker, while Sunday's result may not have been the one we were all hoping for, I know that the whole House will want to congratulate Gareth Southgate and the England squad for their fantastic achievements over the last month. The nation is proud of each and every one of them. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I second the Prime Minister's support for our outstanding England team and players, but perhaps say that it's a pity it didn't come sooner from him and We all know the importance of double vaccination, especially against the Delta or Johnson variant of the virus. But in Hammersmith and Fulham, despite the hard work of our local NHS council and volunteers, only 36% of adults have been double jabbed. So will the Prime Minister think again before recklessly removing all barriers to infection and transmission on the 19th of January? Will he keep the regulations on mask wearing and, like the Mayor of London, keep fighting the virus until it's beat?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if we had followed the honourable gentleman's precepts, and I remember, of course, he campaigned vehemently to stay in the European Union, we would not have achieved the fastest vaccine rollout of any European country and have vaccinated the highest proportion of any European population, Mr. Speaker. That is the reality. And as for his criticism of the roadmap, Mr. Speaker, I respectfully point out to the honourable gentleman the month is July, not January, Mr. Speaker.
We now come to Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Mr. Speaker, it should be obvious that the Cabinet is as inclusive as the English football team, and some of these criticisms, I think, are misplaced. Can I welcome, Mr. Speaker, your words at the beginning of Tuesday's debate and the Prime Minister's first paragraph on the Treasury Minute from Monday? Can we agree that a vote in this House does not amend an Act of Parliament passed by both Houses? Are we expecting a similar debate in another place? And can I suggest to the Prime Minister that instead of leaping from point 5 to point 7 at some stage in the future, we step towards it, because a 40% increase in 1 year is ludicrous, and perhaps the Chancellor can consider going to 5.5, 6, 6.5 and then 7. Thank you.
I thank the right honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, very much for his opening point. And just on on odour, of course, I can give him this reassurance. We will continue to follow the law, and he will have heard clearly what both my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, had to say from this dispatch box, and what I said as well. We want to return to point 7 as fast as we can, when fiscal conditions allow.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by thanking the England football team for everything they've given this country over the last 6 weeks. I'm so proud of this young, diverse and humble team and everything that it represents. Mr. Speaker, they're the very best of modern Britain, everything that I know this country can be. Does the Prime Minister think that it was wrong to criticise the England team's decision to oppose racism by taking the knee as gesture politics?
I agree very much with what the Right Honourable Gentleman has said about the England team. And I repeat, I want to thank each and every one of them for what they did, their incredible campaign they ran in the Euro 2020 Championships. And they do represent the very best of our country. And I repeat that I utterly condemn and abhor the racist outpourings that we saw on Sunday night. And so what we're doing is today taking practical steps to ensure that the football banning order regime is changed, so that if you are guilty, Mr. Speaker, of racist abuse online of footballers, then you will not be going to the match. No ifs, no buts, no exemptions and no excuses.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, that just won't wash. And it rings hollow. On the 7th, remind the Prime Minister and the House, on the 7th of June, the Prime Minister's spokesperson said this: on taking the knee, specifically, the Prime Minister is more focused on actions rather than gestures. On the 14th of June, the Home Secretary said, I just don't support people participating in that type of gesture politics. The Conservative MP for Bassetlaw called it a ridiculous, empty gesture. So there's no point of pretending that these things weren't said. The England footballer, Tyrone Mings, said that Labour Party member I hear shouted out. Is that really the response? Is that it? Tyrone Mings said, and the House might want to listen, he said this: labelling anti-racism messages as gesture politics served to stoke the fire of racism and hatred. Prime Minister, they're powerful words from someone who has himself been subjected to racist abuse. He's right, isn't he? Yep.
Mr. Speaker, I want to reiterate our total support for our fantastic England team, and I support them in the way that they show solidarity with their friends who face racism, Mr. Speaker. But when he talks about the Home Secretary, let me just remind him that my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has faced racism and prejudice all her career of a kind that he can never imagine, and she has taken practical steps to get black and minority officers into the police in record numbers. In fact, Prime Speaker, I am...
Sorry to interrupt you. I want to hear the Prime Minister. If his own side don't want to hear him, I'm sure the tea room will accommodate them. It's very important to listen to what the Prime Minister's got to say. Have you finished, Prime Minister? Are you OK? Yeah. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I totally condemn all racism, including that directed at the Home Secretary. But she's got this wrong. The whole country knows it. His own MPs know it. In the last few days, everybody has seen England's black players have been the targets of disgusting racist abuse following Sunday's match. Disgusting. And this is really simple, Mr. Speaker. Either the Prime Minister is with the England players in their stand against racism, or he can defend his own record, those of his ministers and some of his MPs. But he can't have it both ways. So can he tell the House, does he now regret failing to condemn those who booed England players for standing up to racism, yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, we made it absolutely clear that no one should boo the England team. And Mr. Speaker, what we're doing now is following the racist abuse that our players sadly suffered on Sunday night and thereafter, we're taking practical action. So in addition to changing the football banning order regime, last night I met representatives of Facebook, of Twitter, of TikTok, of Snapchat, of Instagram, and I made it absolutely clear to them that we will legislate to address this problem, Mr. Speaker, in the online harms bill, and unless they get hate and racism off their platforms, they will face fines amounting to 10% of their global revenues, and we all know, Mr. Speaker, that they have the technology to do it.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the online harms bill has been promised for 3 years. I'm not sure a 15-minute chat at a garden party moves things forward that significantly. But I want to take the Prime Minister up on what he said about being absolutely clear, because here I have the headline, Mr. Speaker: Boris Johnson refuses to condemn fans booing England taking the knee. That's the story, that's the headline, June the 6th. Boris Johnson refuses to condemn fans booing England taking the new. That's absolutely clear. It's not quite what the Prime Minister is implying today. It goes on to quote the Prime Minister's spokesperson, saying that the Prime Minister fully respects the rights of those who choose to make their feelings known. This is about booing. Fully respects their rights. And the Home Secretary said that booing was a choice for them, quite frankly. So no condemnation there, no absolute clarity there, Mr. Speaker. When senior government ministers and Conservative MPs defend the booing of an anti-racist message, who do they think they're defending, Prime Minister, and why are they defending it?
Mr. Speaker, nobody defends booing of the England side. Nobody defends booing of the England side. And if he continues to attack the Home Secretary...
Prime Minister, look, I want to hear the Prime Minister. I want to know the answer, and I expect the opposition to listen to the answer. Prime Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We love and admire the England side and what they did. They represent the best of our country. Nobody defends booing the England side, Mr. Speaker. But what the Home Secretary has been trying to do all her life is not just to fight racism, but to take practical steps to advance the cause of black and minority ethnic groups, which he has done successfully, notably in the police. And since, Mr. Speaker, he's chucking this kind of thing around, could I ask him now to retract this leaflet produced by the Labour Party during the Batley and Spen by-election, which was condemned by his own MPs as dog whistle racism, Mr. Speaker?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister isn't kidding anyone in this House. He's not kidding the public, and he's not even kidding his own MPs. Let me quote the Conservative MP for Plymouth Moor View. Conservative MP, the painful truth, says the Conservative MP for Plymouth Moor View, is that Tyrone Mings is completely right. I am very uncomfortable, he says, with the position we Conservatives are needlessly forcing ourselves into. So, Prime Minister, behind you, they don't believe you, and neither do we. Mr. Speaker, we can all see what's happened here. The government has been trying to stoke a culture war, and they've realised they're on the wrong side. And now they hope that nobody's noticed. Why else would a Conservative MP boast that he's not watching his own team? Why else would another Conservative MP say that Marcus Rashford spends too much time playing politics when he's actually trying to feed children that the government won't? And why will the Prime Minister refuse time and time again, even now, to condemn those who boo our players for standing up against racism? Mr. Speaker, what is it that this England team symbolises that this Conservative Party is so afraid of?
Mr. Speaker, I think the House will judge for themselves the quality of the question that the right honourable gentleman has just put. I think the whole House is united, including our distinguished members from Scotland, by the way, Mr. Speaker, in admiration of the England team and of every single member of that squad and what they did. And we stick up for them, Mr. Speaker. And what we're doing is taking practical steps to fight racism, changing the football banning order regime, fining the online companies, and, by the way, we will use more legislation if we have to, just as we use the threat of legislation, Mr. Speaker, to stop the European Super League. And we will get on. We will get on with delivering for the people of this country. We will get on with vaccinating the people of this country while they continue to vacillate. We will continue to immunise the people of this country while they improvise and dart around. And, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to engage in a political culture war of any kind. I want to get on with delivering for the people of this country. He simply wants to get on with dithering.
Keir Starmer.
He doesn't want to engage in a culture war and point scoring. Give me a break. Football's a game. Racism isn't, Prime Minister. That's why many of us have been involved in the charity Show Racism the Red Card for years. But far from giving racism the red card, the Prime Minister gave it the green light. And I'll tell you the worst kind of gesture politics, Mr. Speaker, putting an England shirt on over a shirt and tie whilst not condemning those booing is the worst kind of gesture. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the Prime Minister, finally, about the reported amnesty for crimes committed during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. I worked in Northern Ireland for 6 years with the Policing Board and the police. I've also prosecuted terrorists as the Director of Public Prosecutions, so I know how difficult and how sensitive this is. But a blanket amnesty, including for terrorists, is plain wrong. I was in Northern Ireland last week, and it's absolutely clear that the government's amnesty is not supported by the political parties in Northern Ireland, and it's not supported by victims groups. Last Thursday, I spoke to victims of terrorism at the Wave Trauma Centre in North Belfast. Mr. Speaker, they haven't even been properly consulted on this proposal. If things are to move forward in Northern Ireland, any discussion has to start with the victims. Politicians in London can't simply draw a line under terrorism and other crimes and then force it on those most affected. The Prime Minister looks up, so let him look up and let him hear. Because I want to quote Julie Hambleton, Prime Minister. Her sister Maxine was among the 21 people killed by the IRA in the Birmingham pub bombings. So that's Julie Hambleton, Prime Minister. She says, tell me, Prime Minister, if one of your loved ones was blown up beyond recognition, where you were only able to identify your son or daughter by their fingernails, would you be so quick to grant their murderers an amnesty and propose such obscene legislation? What does the Prime Minister have to say to Julie, and she's listening, and other victims like her?
Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House will acknowledge the suffering of victims like Julie and their families. And, of course, nothing I say or can do now can in any way mitigate her loss, and that is clear. But it is also true that the people of Northern Ireland must, if we possibly can allow them to, they must move forwards now. And he will know that the proposals that are being brought forward, and the House will hear about them in more detail later on from my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. The proposals that are being brought forward are measured, they are balanced, and they have a wide degree of support, I may say, from former Labour Prime Ministers and former Labour leaders who I think are of considerable more distinction, I may say, than the right honourable gentleman opposite. And he will recall that it was under that Labour administration that many terrorists were unfortunately given effectively an amnesty, and they were allowed to escape the full consequences of their crimes, as he knows very well, and that is the reality, whilst the sad fact remains that, and this is of course no consolation to people like Julie, but the sad fact remains that there are many members of the armed services who continue to face the threat of vexatious prosecutions well into their 70s and 80s and later. And we are finally, Mr. Speaker, bringing forward a solution to this problem, to enable the province of Northern Ireland to draw a line under the Troubles, to enable the people of Northern Ireland to move forward. And I think someone with greater statesmanship and clarity of vision would have seen that, Mr. Speaker, and given these proposals a fair wind.
Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the scandalous situation at Wally's Quarry landfill in my constituency with the noxious gas emissions is, I'm afraid, continuing. To date, there's been no apology from the operator, Red Industries, and no credible explanation for the odour that is blighting the lives and the health of so many of my residents. So what assurances can the Prime Minister give me today that every effort will be made to speed up the works that have been mandated by the Environment Agency, that we will get a deadline as to when we can expect this awful situation to be resolved, and that those responsible are held fully to account?
Stop the statement. Mr. Speaker, I yield to no one in my admiration for the Environment Agency, but in this case, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend because they are not, in my view, sorting this problem out fast enough. I am fed up with this being raised with me. We must stop the stink, and I want the air around Wally's Quarry to be of alpine freshness before too long.
Ian Blackford, the SNP leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me begin by congratulating the England team for reaching the final, an incredible achievement. But the tragedy of the tournament was the undercurrent of racism that was ultimately targeted at 3 young men, Rashford, Sancho and Saka. Mr. Speaker, wherever there is racism, it falls on all of us to face it down and to call it out. And it is shameful that it took until last night for the Prime Minister to meet with the main social media companies and finally wake up to the fact that those who publish and promote vile, racist online abuse need to be faced down and sanctioned. So, can the Prime Minister tell us what sanctions he thinks would be appropriate for someone who publishes racist content? And it is shocking even to have to say this out loud, describing Africans as flag-waving piccaninnies with watermelon smiles.
Shameful. Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've commented many times about the words that I've said in the past, and I think the House understands how. And I think the House understands how you can take things out of context, Mr. Speaker. I think people do understand that. But what they also understand is that there is a chance now to hold these internet companies to account and to make sure that they face fines running to 10% of their global income if they fail to take hate and racism off their platforms, Mr. Speaker. And I hope, actually, that the Scottish Nationalist Party will support it.
Ian Blackford.
You know, still no contrition, still no apology. And, Mr. Speaker, the truth is that the Tory party doesn't sanction those who publish that kind of racist content. They promote them to be Prime Minister. The legacy of this Prime Minister's dog whistling has followed him into 10 Downing Street, and it is now at the heart of this Tory government. As the England International Tyrone Mings has so powerfully stated, this government doesn't get to stoke the fires of racism and pretend to be disgusted when it happens. They don't get to condemn the racism of others, but deny that the racism that they have even provoked. In March, this UK government's own report on racism, the Sewell report, said that there was no systemic problem in the UK. I think the England men's football team would beg to differ. After the shocking racism on show over the last week, does the Prime Minister still stand by his government's belief that systemic racism is not a problem that exists in the United Kingdom?
Mr. Speaker, I do think that racism is a problem in the United Kingdom, and I believe it needs to be tackled and it needs to be stamped out with some of the means that I've described this morning. But when he attacks our party, my party, Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he's got the wrong target. This is a party that has not only had the first ever Muslim Secretary of State for Health, now he was former Chancellor, of course, but has had 2 female Prime Ministers, the most diverse cabinet in the history of this country, the most diverse government in the history of this country, Mr. Speaker. We are the party. If you are a young person growing up in a black or ethnic minority group in this country, we are the party that represent hope and opportunity. That is the reality about the Conservative Party today.
Julie Balson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is packed full of incredible innovation-led businesses capable of leading entire industries, not least in Hertford and Stortford, where we are at the heart of the innovation corridor. I know this government wants to ensure the best possible access to venture funding over multiple rounds to catapult scale-up businesses full of potential into world-beating companies. Would the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can best make venture work for the scale-up community and transform some of our best ideas into some of the world's biggest businesses?
I thank the Honourable Lady, and she knows a lot about what the subject that she mentions. This is a fantastic opportunity for this country because we do indeed produce a great many tech breakthroughs, and we're looking very much at how to make sure that we scale up fast. But don't let her forget that as I speak, there are 3 countries in the world, Mr. Speaker, that have scaled up tech breakthroughs to unicorns worth more than $1 billion, 100 unicorns worth more than £1 billion. Only 3 countries have 100 unicorns. They are the United States of America, China and the United Kingdom.
Ms. Savile-Roberts.
For over 7 years, Plaid Cymru has been calling for the gargantuan HS2 railway to be treated as an England-only project so that Wales gets our fair share. Not a single inch of track will be in Wales, but we're footing the bill. Today, the Welsh Affairs Committee backed our call, calling the UK Government's categorisation of HS2 in relation to Wales as unfair and biased. Will the Prime Minister today right this wrong, respect the Welsh Affairs Select Committee and ensure that Wales, like Scotland, receives our fair share from HS2?
I normally have a great deal of respect and interest in what the Honourable Lady says, but actually in this case she's missed what the government is doing for transport connectivity in Wales and to Wales, something about which I know that she's as passionate as I am. Look at what we're doing in the Union Connectivity Review with the A55, with the North Wales Railway corridor into Liverpool, and look at the M4, Mr. Speaker. Never let it be forgotten that it was the Welsh Labour government, not her fault, of course, because she's plied, but it was the Welsh Labour government, Mr. Speaker, that spent £144 million on a study, and then didn't even do the diversion.
Let's go to Dr. Matthew Offord. Matthew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The circumstances of Jewish burials around the world is a sensitive and important issue to my constituents, and as such to me. In January 1942, the Nazis built 2 concentration camps on British soil on the island of Alderney. Conditions were appalling, with multiple deaths. However, there are just 397 recorded graves in Alderney, just 6.6% of a total population of 6,000 internees. In 1961, a British delegation undertook an inquiry into these atrocities that occurred on Alderney. Today, I ask the Prime Minister to authorise the release of all documents and information residing in the archives into those investigations, so we know what happened to thousands of people on the island of Alderney during World War II. To quote Elie Wiesel, to forget the dead will be akin to killing them again.
Minister.
My honourable friend makes an excellent point about the victims on Alderney. We must never forget the suffering of those who, on the Channel Islands, who suffered under occupation between 1940 and 1945. I'm told that the documents in question have been transferred to the National Archives, Mr. Speaker, but I will make sure that the relevant minister meets my honourable friend to discuss the matter further.
Kyle.
Mr. Speaker, there are currently 800,000 students self-isolating, and even after the reforms to the bubbling system, the government's failure to get the Delta variant under control means that infections rising over the summer will mean that the autumn term will be very severely affected in our schools. If the JCVI says that it is safe and appropriate for adolescents to receive the vaccine, will the Prime Minister promise that every single adolescent will be offered the vaccine over the summer and parents given all the information they need to make an informed decision so that schools can return and not continue to be affected by the bad policy making of this government and the failure to get the Delta variant under control?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman seems to want us to relax our rules on protecting people from coronavirus. I don't think that's the right thing to do at this time on self-isolation. And he also calls for us to go against the JCVI, and that is a matter, Mr. Speaker, for the JCVI.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the economy rebounding and a great many job vacancies currently available, does my right honourable friend agree that there's a tremendous opportunity emerging now to build a stronger British labour market post-Brexit and post-COVID, and that we need to help employers create jobs with better pay, more security, more opportunity for skills and career progression? Isn't that one of the keys for levelling up and ending the blight of in-work poverty?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend, and I know how much he cares about them, and that's one of the reasons why we're not only rolling out our massive plan for jobs, but why I'm proud that under this government we've increased the national living wage by a record amount to £8.91 per hour.
Let's go to Peter Grant. Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The communities of Leslie, Markinch, Echuca, Thornton, Woodside and East Weems in my constituency are all either losing or have already lost their post offices since 2019. In addition, constituents in Coltna, Blagonie, Windigates, Cadham, Methil, Buckhaven and Methil Hill have all had the disruption of temporary closures or relocations, and the post office at Glenwood is currently closed until further notice. Given that the post office is 100% owned by his government, what exactly does it take for him to admit that the current trading model for the post office is not working for the people that rely on its services?
Mr. Speaker, the treatment of the post office, the masters, the sub-post masters in the recent computer malfunction was, I'm afraid, appalling, and I've made that clear. When it comes to protecting and supporting post offices, particularly rural post offices, but I think is what he was driving at, this government will do everything it can to protect them.
Let's go to Angela Richardson. Angela.
Mr. Speaker, too noisy, too much air pollution, and too much time wasted sitting in traffic, impacting productivity. The A3, as it narrows through Guildford, has been the cause of frustration for decades. According to Highways England, there are no more sticking plasters, which is why I'm calling for the A3 to be tunnelled under Guildford. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that as we build back better after the pandemic, investment into major road infrastructure solutions will be an important part of delivering on the levelling up agenda right across the whole country?
Minister.
I thank my honourable friend. I know the stretch of road that she refers to very well, as I'm sure many members across this House do as well. I would love to be able to clip my fingers and say that we could tunnel under Guildford. All I can say is, Mr. Speaker, in all candor, we will certainly look at it. But honourable members should be in no doubt that we're spending record sums, £27 billion on improving England's strategic roads, part of a £640 billion biggest and best ever package of infrastructure investment in this country.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many people are aghast at the potential consequences of trashing English COVID regulations in a triumphalist prime ministerial crash attack. Wales's regulations, to be announced today, are expected to take a cautious and measured approach. Will the Prime Minister make it clear that those visiting Wales this summer must stick to Welsh laws, and that on COVID regulations, he can only speak for England?
Prime Minister.
Yes, of course, Mr. Speaker, and I think that people should stick to the rules and the guidance wherever they are, and I think he's absolutely right to talk about a cautious and a measured approach.
John Penrose.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will have seen that two recently published Government Commission reports, mine into competition policy and the Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, both make the same two recommendations to inject fresh energy into our better regulation regime so we can deliver our Brexit ambition of replacing ponderous EU regulations with simpler, digital and less burdensome UK equivalents without reducing quality standards in the process. So, will he take this opportunity to unleash a big post-Brexit better regulation dividend by declaring his enthusiastic support for a strong new one-in, two-out regime with no loopholes or exceptions right here today?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and I think it is obvious that the UK has a massive amount to gain, not just from his report, which I much enjoyed, as I told him I thought was excellent, but also from the TIGA report, the Task Force on Reducing Regulation, and I thank them for that, and they'll be seeing, he and they will be seeing a lot more in the next few weeks.
Let's go to John Nicholson. John.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir. Yesterday, at the Prime Minister's instigation, 333 Conservative members of this House, including some of its wealthiest, voted to deprive some of the world's poorest children of clean water. Education for girls programmes we guaranteed will be slashed. Polio eradication schemes too. Most people go into politics to make the world a better place, but the Prime Minister seems to be an exception. As he reads of the anguish his decision has caused, and as the father of a young child, doesn't he feel the merest hint of shame?
Mr. Speaker, I think the people of this entire country should be immensely proud of what the UK is doing abroad, whether it is educating millions of girls with an increase to support for female education, whether it is helping the countries around the world to tackle climate change with £11.6 billion of investment, or helping refugees in Yemen or Syria or Ethiopia with £900 million. We're spending £10 billion a year on overseas aid alone, Mr. Speaker, to say nothing of what we're doing with vaccines. The whole country should be immensely proud of what the UK is doing in spite of this pandemic.
Let's go to Faye Jones. Faye.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you will know the Green Man Festival, which is an incredibly popular international music event, which takes place in Crickhowell in my constituency. The festival organisers have gone to great lengths to ensure the event is COVID secure, but the Welsh Government refuses to give them the green light to go ahead as a test event, unlike similar events in England. So will my right honourable friend help us by giving the Green Man Festival his full support and encourage the Welsh Government to get behind the festival at long last?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I haven't been invited to attend the Green Man Festival, but it sounds great. She's obviously my honourable friend's obviously a big fan. I will do what I can to pass her message along. I thank her for campaigning for Wales and for the Green Man Festival.
Mr. Speaker, my constituent Jackie Davis was diagnosed with a type of blood cancer in April, which prevents her immune system from developing antibodies against COVID. Jackie wants to live as normal a life as possible and to do everyday things like going shopping, but she's terrified and she thinks that the rapid lifting of restrictions on Monday is putting her at risk. With the Delta variant about to spike due to the government's decision to lift restrictions, particularly the requirement to wear masks in public places, what's his message to people in Jackie's situation? Will he rethink his reckless gamble of lifting all these restrictions on Monday? And yes, Jackie did support staying in the EU.
Well, my message I'm sorry, obviously, for the condition that Jackie suffers, and I think that the Labour Party obviously needs to work out whether it's in favour of going ahead with step 4 or not, because it's not at all clear from what he has said or what the right honourable gentleman, the leader of the opposition, has said. They don't have a clue, Mr. Speaker. But what I can say to him is that we expect and recommend everybody, and I say this to Jackie, we expect to recommend everybody to wear a face covering in a confined space where you're meeting people you don't normally meet, and that is quite right.
Final question, Nikki Aiken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with the Reading Agency that is about to launch its annual Summer Reading Challenge and hopes to reach 1 million children, primary school children, this year. What a great excuse to go to one of our brilliant libraries and take part in the COVID education catch-up. With this in mind, would my right honourable friend join me in encouraging every child across the nation to take part in the Summer Reading Challenge, pick up a book and read back better?
Yes. I thank my honour. She's quite right, and there couldn't be a better campaign for the summer. We put 1.9 million of support into the reading scheme that she mentions, but of course there's 200 million going into the Holidays Activities Fund, and there couldn't be a better, more useful, happier way of occupying your time on holiday than by reading a good book, Mr. Speaker.
Can I just gently say to all leaders that in the end I've had to cut off quite a few backbenchers because of the amount of time that's been taken up at the beginning. Can we think about those as well? It's so important that they get their questions heard. There's no points for order from that. I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements for the next business period. Order. Order. I now call Nick Thomas-Symonds to ask the urgent question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for the Home Department if she will make a statement on the prevalence of racist abuse on social media.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. I'm going to take a moment, if I may, to reflect on the extraordinary success of the England football team in this tournament, knowing as we do that the background to the urgent question. That team played their hearts out for us, and they won through to the first international final for 55 years. They did so with enormous skill, with sportsmanship, and with dignity. They brought our country together, and they united us in joy. It is therefore a great shame that the success and achievements of every member of that team has been overshadowed by the racism of online trolls. The Prime Minister has just, in Prime Minister's questions, reinforced our collective condemnation of racism online and offline. Individuals who commit racist offences should face the full force of the law, and we already have robust legislation in place to deal with online hate. But governments around the world are grappling with how we collectively tame the wild west of the internet. We are leading the world in tackling online harms in the introduction of the Online Safety Bill. It put in place measures to tackle illegal and legal but harmful abuse, including racist abuse. If major platforms do not meet their own standards to keep people safe and address abuse quickly and effectively, they could face enforcement action. Let one message ring loud and clear to those companies. There is no reason for companies to wait until the regime is fully running to take action against this abhorrent abuse. Indeed, such delays, I suspect, Mr. Speaker, will serve to stiffen the resolve of the government and indeed of this House. In addition to this, we have asked the Law Commission to conduct a wide-ranging review into hate crime, including offensive online communications. Let's put this in context. In 2019 to 2020, the police recorded more than 76,000 race hate crimes. Increases in police-recorded hate crime in recent years have been driven by improvements in crime recording and better identification of what constitutes a hate crime. While statistics can help us track trends, we must, of course, always remember that behind the numbers are real people who are often left traumatised and shaken by their experiences. There is nothing so damaging, so corrosive, about the impact that racism has both on victims and on our communities more widely. And so I'd like to conclude this statement with the words of our England captain, Gareth Southgate. We have been a beacon of light in bringing people together. The national team stands for everybody, and so that togetherness has to continue. We have shown the power our country has when it does come together. Mr. Speaker, let us all live up to those words.
Now call Nick Thomas.
I'm grateful for that response, but the reaction of this government has lacked urgency and completely failed to understand the scale of the revulsion that exists as a result of the events of recent days. The England men's football players have been a credit to the country on and off the pitch. And when they took the knee to stand against racism, this was not gesture politics. They spoke courageously to a desire for change across our country. And the failure of the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary to condemn those who were booing the team taking the knee was shameful, and it frankly makes their later protestations of support for the team no more than empty words. And the Home Secretary hasn't even bothered to turn up to answer this question today. The racist abuse to which Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho and Bukayo Saka have been subjected is disgraceful, and such behaviour has been too common on social media for too long. Social media platforms have had more than long enough to act. The Home Secretary said to me on Monday that legislation will be absolutely pivotal, but the government has dragged its feet on bringing the Online Harms Bill forward. Worse still, the bill as currently proposed will not address what we've seen in the last couple of days. Allowing social media companies to set their own terms and conditions will not be enough. Will the government therefore commit to including criminal sanctions for senior executives in that bill? And in addition, will the Minister tell us exactly when the government will be acceding to the demand on these benches to extend football banning orders to offences that take place online, as was promised by the Prime Minister in Prime Minister's questions? And finally, will the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary finally show some leadership and apologise for siding with those who are booing and not with the brave England players?
Mr. Speaker, if I may, I'd just explain to the House where the Home Secretary is today. She is, at this very moment, hosting a long-standing meeting with charities who are on the front line of tackling victims, tackling violence against women and girls and survivors of those crimes. And so I hope the House will instead put up with me in order to answer this urgent question. But I know that the Home Secretary would reject many of the, indeed all of the allegations that the Honourable Gentleman has just made about her conduct. She has been relentless. She has been relentless in pursuing social media companies to ensure that they take much tougher stances, as we all expect, not just in relation to racism online, but also child sexual exploitation and terrorism and other offences. And so I do not accept his accusations across the dispatch box. In terms of the online safety bill, this is a landmark piece of legislation. The government has been very, very careful to ensure that this bill, A, receives the scrutiny of the House. That is why we are taking the confident step, I would say, of opening the draft bill up to pre-legislative scrutiny. We don't do that for every bill, but we want to get this bill right. The House will remember we did exactly the same with the domestic abuse bill, and the bill was made all the better for it. And so I'm delighted that Labour have provided now, I understand, the names for their committee members so that the pre-legislative scrutiny can take place at pace. But I underline the message that this House, but also the public, are watching the behaviours of online companies very carefully. Any company would be very wise to set out what it plans to do in relation to meeting the expectations of this place and the public when it comes to conducting their systems in a way that is clear and that prevents the sorts of abuse we have seen this weekend. In terms of football banning orders, again, the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, forgive me, would have heard the Prime Minister say very clearly at PMQs about the work that the government is conducting in relation to football banning orders. It is complex because we know, for example, some of the trolls that have targeted some members of the team over the weekend are overseas. But we want very much to work with football clubs and others to ensure that these orders have the powers that we all want them to have. And as I have said throughout, and this is the golden thread that runs throughout our work on tackling online crimes, what is illegal offline is illegal online, and that is the principle we will be adopting throughout the online safety bill.
Simon Fell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my honourable friend for a statement and for calling out some of the vile racist abuse that our brilliant players have had to face. On Sunday night, the Centre for Countering Digital Hate identified and reported 105 Instagram accounts which racially abused members of the England football team. As of this morning, only 6 of them have been taken down. So whilst we're getting warm words from some of these social media companies, that appears to be all we're getting from them at present. Can my honourable friend therefore confirm that the online safety bill will be brought forward with speed and that those who post this abuse online will be held to proper account?
Extremely grateful. Indeed, my honourable friend highlights some of the very practical responses that social media companies can take right now. They don't need to wait for the online safety bill. I read with some dismay and anger a report in the paper today about how Instagram had applied its own rules community rules in relation to offensive emojis that were sent to players and indeed highly offensive words. Now, the social media companies themselves have to explain how exactly their community rules accord with the expectations and indeed the law of our country. But may I just make this point again? We are not alone in this. This is a challenge facing every democratic society in the world, and it is by working together, as we are doing with our voluntary principles on tackling terrorism and child sexual exploitation, that is how we're going to be able to make real progress against these companies and against this hatred.
We now go to SNP spokesperson Stuart C. MacDonald. Stuart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The disgusting online racism faced by England players is unfortunately overshadowing a fantastic tournament and a fantastic performance by an England team that has rightly attracted admiration and perhaps even a little bit of envy. So yes, we urgently need stronger online regulation. Content must be taken down faster, and platforms can no longer be allowed to support racist content through shamefully lax rules. And we need a debate on how we identify and punish those peddling this hate. But will she agree that social media regulation is not a silver bullet? Online racism reflects offline racism, and the government needs to take tackling racism, including structural and institutional racism, more seriously. Mr. Speaker, whatever our disagreements, no one could say that the previous Prime Minister didn't take tackling racism incredibly seriously. Why do we struggle to say the same about the current Prime Minister? Isn't it because on his watch, too many in his party have spent more time downplaying racism than tackling it, and more time ridiculing anti-racism campaigners than going after those who actually peddle racism? So yes, we'll support action to clamp down on online platforms, but will she support a change in attitude in her party?
Again, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question, and I can assure him that had Scotland reached the same dizzy heights as England, I'd have been cheering them on with great passion and strength of feeling. So I'm pleased that he is able to concede some support for the England team. In terms of his wider question about racism and hate speech across society, he is right to acknowledge that this is a matter for us all to tackle, and he will know, as sitting on the Home Affairs Select Committee as he does, the work that the government is doing to tackle hate speech and hate crimes. Of course, hate crimes is a very wide term. It includes not simply racism, but also hatred towards disabled people, towards transgender people and so on. And so that's why we have asked the Law Commission to look at online crimes to make sure that they're up to date and meet our expectations. But the wider message, I think, on racism more generally is actually I have been overwhelmed by the public's response to these trolls over the weekend. If we look at what happened to the mural in Withington, for example, and how the public responded, how angry they were that some individual had defaced the mural in Withington, and how positive the public's reaction to that has been. I think that is what we need to very much reflect on and act on. And indeed, that's why I quoted our captain, because I think he has summed up where the public and where we are on this. And it is by working together that we're going to tackle some of these hateful attitudes.
Well, good luck. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Home Secretary herself has been at the receiving end of terrible racist abuse. So will the Minister agree with me that fighting racism online and in any other form is a priority for her and for the government? And does she also agree that this fight is mostly effective when racism and anti-racism campaigns are fully understood by everyone, and that what really matters is when meaningful action is taken to tackle the scourge that racism is?
Very much so. And the Home Secretary, like other members across this House, and we know, sadly, that women in particular, women of colour, are targeted, it seems, by online trolls. There are many people in our society who have to deal with this racism, both online but also, sadly, offline. And so I think part of our national conversation should be how we can each of us show our complete support for the campaigns to combat racism and to ensure that we are doing everything we can, both individually but as a country, to tackle racist behaviour. I know the Home Secretary feels very strongly about this, and indeed she has been particularly strong in her communications with tech companies across the 2 years she has been in office. But I know that that is a feeling shared by many in this House, and as I say, I'm very conscious that there are others in this place who are victims as well.
Let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Yvette Cooper. Yvette?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the Instagram profiles of England heroes this lunchtime are still racist posts, including blatantly racist words and emojis that have been up for more than 24 hours. I have challenged Instagram on this from the Home Affairs Committee repeatedly over the last few days. They have told me this morning that using some of those emojis as racist slurs is against their rules, yet inexplicably, they are still up and it is still taking them days to remove these posts. Speed matters. Can the Minister tell me what the online safety bill is actually going to do to take action on this speed issue and to penalise companies for not moving fast enough? Because at the moment, it looks as though that action won't happen. That's unacceptable. Keyboard cowards are being given a megaphone by these social media companies, and it has to stop.
Well, I completely agree with the Right Honourable Lady and Chair of Home Affairs Select Committee. It is, I don't think these tech companies quite understand the anger and frustration of everyone involved in trying to scrutinise and to hold these companies to account when they come back at us with, it doesn't meet our community rules. Words such as the words I suspect she is thinking about, the emojis, the language, this is unacceptable in any civilised society, and that includes online fora as well as offline. And so this bill is a real opportunity for the government, A, to lay the law down, but also, as I say, for parliamentarians across the House to make their views known. I have long urged the companies to listen carefully to members of Parliament in this place, and I would urge them again to do so, because if they don't listen, we will act.
We now come to Felicity Button.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As someone who represents one of the most diverse constituencies in the entire country, can I put on the record how abhorrent racism is of any form? Yeah. Does my honourable friend agree with me that many of these online trolls hide behind the cloak of anonymity? Can she confirm that the police can still prosecute anonymous postings? And will she consider whether we should outlaw online posting? Because I do think people would take more personal responsibility if it were in their own names.
Well, the Honourable Lady alights upon a very important point, but also actually one that will require the scrutiny and the debate of this House, because whilst we know that many cowards hide behind anonymous accounts, there are people who use their anonymity legitimately. So, for example, victims of domestic abuse and indeed whistleblowers in very restrictive regimes overseas. So I know that this place, when we come to scrutinise this bill, will weigh those arguments up very carefully. But again, I do have great sympathy with her viewpoint that if people are able to hide behind these accounts anonymously, then of course it makes it much more difficult for the police to trace them. And so again, we need to think through, I think, as, collectively, where we are prepared to draw the boundaries in the wild west of the internet.
We now come to Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister gave the usual Tory platitudes. Yes, she condemned the horrific racism our England stars have faced, but what will she think about the Prime Minister when he was doing, when he was describing black people as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, when he used newspaper columns to mock Muslim women as letterboxes and bank robbers, when he refused to condemn the booing of England players taking the knee, and when his Home Secretary derided the anti-racist message as gesture politics, isn't it the case, Mr. Speaker, like England star Tyrone Mings has said, that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister were stoking the fire of racism, giving the green light to racism, and only now, when the consequences are clear, are they feigning outrage?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I had hoped that we were going to be able to conduct this debate in a measured and collective way. I don't genuinely think the Honourable Lady is accusing either the Prime Minister of this country or indeed the Home Secretary of racism. That would be a truly extraordinary allegation to make. But I hope at some point we will be able to work together to tackle racism. That is what we all want to do. That is what the work of this government is directed towards. And I hope that we're able to just lower the tone a little bit and understand that again, she's trying to shout at me, again, that in tackling these horrific instances of racism, we need to work collectively together, and shouting at me across the dispatch box is not going to help with that.
Let's go to Damien Collins. Damien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the incidence of racism on social media over the last few days shows why the approach taken in the draft online safety bill is right, that we need an independent regulator that will hold the companies to account? They've failed to take down this abuse, even though it's against their platform policies. They've failed to take it down when people have complained about it. And worse than that, their own recommendation tools were actually promoting the content on Sunday night. This has to stop, and it'll only stop when there's independent regulation of these companies.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. He is absolutely right in his description of this bill as being necessary and required. As I said, I think in 10, 15 years' time, we will look back on this era of the internet, and we will, with the regulations in place, we will be in a much better place in terms of people being able to access social media and so on in a positive, healthy way, rather than having to put up with this hatred that we have seen in some quarters. But I also would emphasise that with the bill, we have, as part of imposing this duty of care, we are proposing fines on the companies concerned of up to £18 million, or, importantly, up to 10% of qualifying annual turnover. I suspect that second figure may be the figure that helps to concentrate minds.
Let's go to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't the issue that the government has refused to take any action towards ending social media discrimination of any kind? This, in turn, has fanned the flames of divisiveness and hate in our communities that we're currently witnessing, as my friend, the member for Coventry South, has just pointed out. The Amnesty International report on toxic Twitter pointed out that Black women are 84% more likely to experience racist abuse online than anyone else. So the question to the Minister is quite simply this: what real steps is she going to take urgently to ensure that no one, and I mean absolutely no one, is able to post any racist abuse online at all?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I suspect I'm not the only person who has felt a little bit astonished that it is this right honourable member who's chosen to ask that question about taking immediate action to tackle racism. I remind the House of the findings of the Equalities and Human Rights Commission under his watch. Labour has unlawfully discriminated against, harassed or victimised people because they are Jewish. And I am also reminded that a Jewish female MP had to have police protection at his party conference because of fears of her own safety. So I will listen to many, many people about tackling racism. I will work with pretty much anyone, but I must say I will take a long spoon in which to sup with this particular member.
Let's just go to Caroline Notes. Caroline.
Mr. Speaker, it is popular to blame mutant algorithms for many things, but social media giants could use algorithms to quickly and effectively shut down accounts spouting racist bile. Please can my honourable friend assure me that the government is prepared to take action against platforms like Instagram, who've been painfully slow to respond to the horrific racist abuse targeted at black players since Sunday?
Indeed, and again, my right honourable friend is alights upon a very, very important point, that this power is already within the reach of internet companies. They seem to think that their community rules somehow take precedence over the laws of our country. And I can only imagine it's the same across other countries in the world. So the message to those tech companies is that please listen to the public's outrage, actually, at some of these posts that are festering on your platforms, and deal with them. It is simply not acceptable to expect players or victims of this abuse to deal with it themselves. These tech companies have the algorithms, they have the powers, I've no doubt, in order to intervene, and they should use them now.
Let's go to Dame Margaret Hodge. Margaret.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is similar, but the racist abuse which was targeted at the black footballers has been absolutely abhorrent. And the tech giants could have stopped it, but they chose not to because it suits their business model. In October 2020, Mark Zuckerberg decided, literally on a whim, to remove Holocaust denial from his Facebook, and he did that. In February 2021, Instagram, after a public outcry, made a U-turn, changed their policy, and started to regulate some direct messages of racial abuse. So does the minister agree with me that it's not the powers or the capability of the tech giants that is lacking, but the will? Everybody knew the Wembley final could result in a torrent of abuse, yet the online platforms chose not to plan, not to monitor, not to act. And does she further agree with me that if we're to turn empty rhetoric into action, it's not enough to fine the companies, but the government must legislate to hold the senior executives to personal account and be personally liable for failing to remove harmful content from their platforms?
Well, I'm extremely grateful and mindful of the own experiences that the Right Honourable Lady has had in terms of abuse online and offline. And I agree with her that, of course, that these powers exist already, and so one can only conclude in the cases that have been highlighted both in this chamber and in newspapers that the businesses concerned do not wish to remove those items. I've no doubt, if I'm wrong, that they will correct me. But there must be a will there, and I very much hope that a former member of this House, one Sir Nick Clegg, who, as we know, advises Facebook at a very senior level in California. I very much hope he is advising Facebook as to the powers of this place and the anger that members across this chamber are feeling, because it seems to me responding to these concerns makes not just good moral sense, but also good business sense.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The abuse we saw after England's heroic final Euro game is beyond disgusting and has no place in any world, let alone the modern world. I know my honourable friend will agree it is not beyond the ingenuity of social media platforms to deploy their vast coding expertise to develop AI and algorithmic solutions to rapidly remove disgusting, abusive, racist posts while still being able to protect appropriate freedom of speech. Sadly, there is more than enough training data for them to use.
Very much so. And my challenge to these tech companies is, look, you have some of the brightest brains in the world. You recruit from the top universities, you pay, I imagine, handsomely, use those brilliant brains to do some good and to stop this abuse on your platforms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole England team has been remarkable in opposing racism and championing justice and equality for all. Sadly, they have not had the full support of this government. It is up to all of us with a public platform, including the Home Secretary, to personally confront racism in all its forms and give our full support to those who are working on it. The Home Secretary is not here today, so I cannot ask her personally, but can I ask her, will she add her support to the petition to ban racists for life from all football matches in England, which now has over 1 million signatures?
I don't know whether the Honourable Lady was in the chamber, but when I explained at the beginning that the Home Secretary is in fact hosting a meeting, a long-standing meeting with charities that work with survivors of violence against women and girls. This is, I hope the House would understand. In terms of her general allegations, I mean, again, I'm minded to just point out that the Home Secretary herself receives extraordinary levels of online hatred. It is eye-watering, some of the things that she and, in fairness, others across this House have to deal with. But I do, as I say, just do urge on members to join together with us in tackling this racism. And in terms of the petition, she may have missed the Prime Minister's answer in PMQs. We are going even better than the petition because we are looking urgently at football banning orders to ensure that people with these racist views who are expressing them are stopped from going to our matches entirely.
Susanna.
Mr. Speaker. Now, I do believe this great and united nation is one of the most tolerant and anti-discrimination nations I know, and that what we have witnessed is orchestrated hate crime by the minority and trolls. And does the Minister agree that we need tougher punishments for racially driven violence, intimidation and abuse on social media, and that the biggest issue I see are the social media companies who have been very slow to take abuse off their platforms?
Again, and my old friend, I know, has worked assiduously, not just in relation to online hatred directed to on racist grounds, but also, of course, other categories of people, other groups of people who are affected on social media, including women. But I hope she will work tirelessly with the government on our forthcoming online safety bill to ensure that these companies do what they should do, clear out their own backyard, but that we also work together to tackle the horrific attitudes that underline this abuse.
Let's go to Catherine McKinnell. Catherine.
Thank you. Minister, we live in an era where online abuse is becoming normalised. The disgusting comments directed at our footballers on social media has in many cases been illegal, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. But in other cases, while being technically legal, the abuse is still extremely harmful and distressing. Warm words and veiled threats are clearly not enough. Will she therefore commit today to ensuring that legal but harmful content will be adequately addressed in the online safety bill, to improving the bill to ensure social media companies' terms and conditions meet a minimum standard, and to ensuring that those standards are enforced so that harmful content is swiftly removed from their platforms?
Yes, very much happy to confirm that, of course, we're looking at legal but harmful material. And indeed, I would just pray to the House's attention the fact that the online safety bill is a really significant piece of legislation, but there will be other fora for legislating, other vehicles for legislating on these sorts of crimes, including, of course, the Victims Bill, but also the Law Commission's work on online hate law more generally. It's really important we get this right. You know, the law has, I think, probably struggled to keep up to date with some of these developing advances in technology, and we've got to make sure that it is future-proofed to cover these terrible crimes.
Let's go to Caroline Ansell. Caroline.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since Sunday's final, everywhere I have been, everyone I have spoken to in my constituency has expressed nothing but pride in our England team. Racist abuse online has in fact inspired an outpouring of support and solidarity. But in contrast, figures released by Twitter in 2020 show the company responded to fewer than 50% of all requests for information from law enforcement in the UK, alongside support for campaigns like Kick It Out. Does my honourable friend agree with me that such social media platforms must seriously raise their game or face serious repercussions?
I completely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm delighted to hear that the football team have received such support in her constituency And indeed, I suspect that is the experience of us all, actually. And the racist attitudes that have been displayed by a small number of people, and indeed trolls, some of whom we know originate from overseas, we want that, they are very much in the minority. The overwhelming majority of us are incredibly proud of our great team.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my register of members' interest in my position as co-chair of the Show Racism, the Red Card all-party parliamentary group. So, can I ask the Minister, Show Racism, the Red Card do fantastic work in tackling racist abuse online and elsewhere, but the Home Office in its wisdom cut its funding to zero 18 months ago, but Show Racism, the Red Card still get funding from both the Scottish and Welsh governments. So can the Minister, or will the Minister, meet me and parliamentary colleagues, Show Racism, the Red Card, so we can discuss their funding to help tackle this scourge in our society?
I'm very happy to do that, and I should point out as well that there's a huge programme of work that continues, including, for example, the online crime hub run by the police that we help to fund. But very happy to meet him to discuss those issues. Look, campaigns that help to tackle racism are clearly in our country's interest, so very, very happy to meet him to discuss it further.
What's Luca?
Sunday night should have been a celebration of achievement. Instead, we woke up in the morning with racism aimed at three men simply doing their job. And this is not acceptable. We know social media is at the centre of the storm, and there's a growing influence across our lives, from bullying, racism, to my interest of body image. So would my right honourable friend agree with me that social media campaigns and their companies have a duty and responsibility to work proactively with government and the police to better our society?
Yes, I most certainly do agree with my honourable friend. And look, in fairness, we have, as the House would expect, we do a lot of work with online companies across a great range of subject matter. Only yesterday, indeed, I was meeting business leaders, including tech leaders, to discuss how we can create opportunities for our hardest to reach young people who are at risk of serious violence. So I'm grateful to them for those activities, but I do think the message is coming out loud and clear, not just in this country, but across the world, that we have got to somehow tame, as I say, the wild west of the internet so that these more hateful practices are not dominating our national headlines and taking away from the great achievements of our England team.
Let's go to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew.
Thank you. Racist abuse online isn't just abhorrent, it normalises and desensitises racist views offline too. And can I say the scenes she's mentioned of the community placing messages of support and love on the defaced Marcus Rashford mural is the true spirit of Greater Manchester, not the graffiti of some pea-brain moron. As a Man City fan, I say that United's Rashford is among the best of us. Now, I welcome the PM's commitment to extending football banning orders to cover online abuse, something this side of the House has been calling for some time. So given the urgency, can I ask her when this will happen and how it will happen?
I will happily write to the Honourable Gentleman on this. I don't have a time frame to hand, but I will very much write to him. And may I thank him as a Man City fan and a Member of Parliament of one of the greatest cities on the planet. Can I thank him for raising the great humour and also the great support that the people of Withington have shown recently.
Jacob.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know social media companies have the tools and powers to prevent online hate, yet it's still happening day in, day out. And the incidents following Sunday evening have shone a light on this disgusting abuse. If social media companies will not act on their own, what actions will the government take to ensure we finally put a full stop to online hate?
Well, my honourable friend has identified the opportunity that the government has, and indeed the House has, in relation to the online safety bill. As I say, I have no doubt that powers that be within the tech companies are watching this debate very closely, and I would assume they have got the message loud and clear from all sides of the House as to our expectations on their next moves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for coming this afternoon. The racist incidents online don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a world where, according to the YMCA, 95% of young black British children have witnessed racism in education. They exist in a world where, according to the Run Me Trust, racism is systematic in the UK, in our health system, in the criminal justice system, in employment, and even in politics, which I know all too well. To every young, black, minority ethnic person, young person watching today, I want them to know that they have a place in this society. They can reach here like I did from a council estate in Brixton, and I will continue to do my bit to ensure we speak out against racism. And this racism also exists in a vacuum where so-called spectators even want to boo their own team. Disgraceful. Social media companies need to take a lot more action, and until they feel the full weight of the law, they won't understand that. So can the Minister confirm if the government will introduce criminal sanctions against social media executives in the online harms bill?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments? And she spoke with such passion, and she's right. Every time she and other members of this House stand up across the chamber to speak on behalf of their constituents, they are role models. And so I'm delighted that this House is more diverse than it has ever been. It needs to be more diverse, but I'm also very proud of the fact that the government is more diverse than it has ever been, and indeed the fact that we have two of the great offices of state filled by people who happen to be of ethnic minority heritage. I think that is a real credit to our country and how one can achieve what one wants with hard work and effort. In terms of the question relating to executives, this is something that we are looking at in the bill. There are measures within there that have been set out in terms of dealing with executives, but of course I welcome her and any other members' input with DCMS to ensure that the bill is meeting the expectations of all.
David Hines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, some of these vile abusers are totally open, but the cloak of anonymity does embolden others. And it also opens a door for hostile actors with their divisive exploitation that can sometimes follow. Now, as the Minister said in response to an earlier question to our friend from Kensington, anonymity is very important in some contexts, including, for example, survivors of domestic abuse. But it doesn't follow that it's therefore required to be available in all contexts. And if you're online communicating in your own identity, shouldn't you be able to say you only want to hear from, be commented on by other people using their own identity? Will the government please look at that again for the online safety bill?
That is an extremely interesting point, and I promise I will look into it.
Let's have a Roberts.
Dear Clefarydd, like thousands of other Welsh fans, I stand with Marcus Rashford and others, including many Welsh players, against the vile racist abuse they've received. Our Tory Home Secretaries have wasted years through their inaction on this issue. In 2016, I introduced an online abuse and cybercrime bill, which included tackling racist abuse online to make the current fragmented law workable in the 21st century. 5 years on, and we're still waiting for action. But a specific question. Will the online harms bill provide clarity on what constitutes illegal racist hate speech against groups of people, as well as offences against individuals?
So the Honourable Lady knows that we have asked the Law Commission to look into the laws relating to malicious online communications. This is, and I declare my interest as a former prosecuting counsel, this is a horribly complex area of law, and as technology develops with, for example, deep fake images and so on, it's very complex, and it is precisely why we asked the Law Commission to look into it. In terms of her other challenges, I mean, again, the bill is going to be scrutinised at length by the House, so she will have the opportunity, no doubt, to put her views forward. But I do want to get the message out. This bill, the online safety bill, needs to be considered carefully, because we very much want it to be a piece of legislation that stands the test of time. And as I say, I can't really think of another country in the world that has entered into such an ambitious project to try to hold some of these corners of the internet, bring them into the light so that we're not seeing these sorts of practices online.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Much of the online racist abuse against England's footballers is thought to have originated from overseas social media accounts. I wonder if honourable friend could tell the House what steps she and her department are taking with counterparts in other countries to ensure there's a concerted international effort to stamp out these appalling attacks, that there is no hiding place.
Yes, I think the Honourable Gentleman's referring to the early analysis of the Premier League. He will know, I hope, will be reassured by the fact that we are looking into this with some urgency because as a global football competition, it is perhaps no leap of the imagination that some of this abuse may have come from overseas. We want to look at that very carefully, but also, again, it underlines the point that the internet, it clearly is available across the world, and so we have to act collectively with other nation states in order to bring these trolls to a heel, and we are already doing that through the Five Eyes and the voluntary principles that we have one agreement on in relation to child sexual exploitation and tackling terrorism.
Let's go to Gregory Campbell. Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join in the congratulations and tributes to the England football team that the Minister has paid and others, and also the condemnation of the abuse suffered by the 3 black players. In a couple of months' time, David in the form of Northern Ireland will take on Goliath in the form of Italy in the World Cup qualifying, Mr. Speaker, and we will endeavour to build on the national pride and endeavour that we've seen in the past few weeks. But on the online safety bill, can the Minister reassert the issue she's raised several times, that if the providers do not act, then they will suffer grievous financial hardship? We will hit them where it hurts, in the corporate pockets.
Well, I'm very pleased to join the Honourable Gentleman's support for Northern Ireland. Italy, I'm sure, will pose no problem for Northern Ireland. I wish them all the greatest of successes. But on the very serious subject of our work to tackle the online hatred that we've seen this weekend, again, the online safety bill is a landmark piece of legislation, and I very much look forward to working with the House in our efforts to take it through.
Let's go to Craig Williams. Craig.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Racism, racist bullying, and any form of bullying is completely unacceptable, and I hope my honourable friend uses all of her powers to stamp down on such behaviour. With regards to divisiveness in our society, it appears that it has become about whether or not you take the knee. Would my honourable friend agree with me that the single biggest cause of divisiveness is the lack of tolerance and the lack of respect from both sides of the argument equally? And it doesn't matter if you choose to take the knee or not. What matters is that you have tolerance and respect for those that want to, and equally for those that don't want to.
Very much. The Honourable Gentleman has, I think, defined what it is to live in a free country. We abide by the principles of free speech within the genuine and legitimate confines of legislation such as hate crime legislation, but the message surely coming from our football team is that we have a wonderfully diverse football team with enormous talent, enormous skills, and we, just as they have treated us with tolerance and respect in terms of their humility in the face of the nation's joy and adoration, so too we should extend that to each other and treat each other with toleration and respect.
Let's go to Janet Davey. Janet.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that when it comes to racist abuse, this is not just confined to social media. On the 3rd of July, the Sunday Times ran an article stating that Raheem Sterling's success in the Euros was being celebrated on the violent streets of Jamaica where he grew up. This sort of ignorant and tasteless commentary only feeds the stereotypes that black people and black populations or countries are dangerous. Will the Minister today condemn the disgusting attitudes that have been propelled by tabloids and broadsheets for decades, and what will she do about it?
Well, I haven't seen the report that she refers to, but I have to say my memory of Raheem Sterling is the story he's told of growing up in the shadow of the arch of Wembley and imagining himself playing under that arch, but instead of being outside the stadium, being inside the stadium. And of course, he has done exactly that. And that shows that in this country, there is opportunity, there is the chance, if you have the talents of Mr. Sterling and others, to really succeed. And I very much hope that that is the message that comes out of our debates, both this afternoon, but also more generally in relation to the horrendous hate crime we have seen over the weekend.
Richard.
Mr. Speaker. And does the Minister agree with me that this should be a matter where actually all sides of the House and all parties come together to ensure that we put an end to racist abuse once and for all? And can she highlight how, through the work on the online safety bill, that this will actually happen?
My honourable friend is absolutely right that by working together, we are so much stronger. And I think today, actually, we have seen that there is great unity of intent and will across the House to ensure that those who are expressing racist views are held to account, they're brought to justice, but that each part of society plays its part, including online companies.
Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister think that their colleagues' refusal to condemn the booing of players for taking the knee, or the dismissal of taking the knee as gesture politics, or Number 10's denial of institutional racism in the UK, or the government's 3-year delay of legislation to the crackdown on online abuse could have given space to a culture or hostile environment which sees the racist abuse of England players as acceptable? And does the Minister regret that denial of the problem and the failure to act?
If I'm just going to temper the Honourable Lady's remarks with some facts. The Home Secretary did not say that she supports football fans booing England players for taking the knee. The Prime Minister was clear in saying that members of the public should be cheering our team, not booing them. And it is, if I may say, we've got to be very careful with how we handle the facts so that when we are presenting our plans for the future to help eradicate racism and our plans for taming the internet, that is how we will achieve this. A little bit of back and forth over the dispatch box is of course welcome and part of our rich tapestry of democracy, but I do hope that the Honourable Lady will stick to the facts next time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I draw the Minister's attention to the paradox identified by Sundar Katwala, who's the Director of British Future, that there are far fewer overt racists in Britain today than there were 20 or 30 years ago, and that's a very good thing. And there are far fewer racist attitudes in Britain. But because of social media and because of the fact that everyone is always online, individuals from the black and ethnic minority communities experience far more racism on a day-to-day basis than they did then because of that paradox. And this is the reason why fixing this needs to be a public policy priority, and why the people in Twitter and Facebook really need to step up. They need to stop people who get banned from opening new accounts, and they need to address the algorithms that promote this material, and that way is how we can rebuild community cohesion.
I think we all acknowledge the echo chamber that social media provides and how being available online across the world enables perhaps just a single person to have far more volume added to their voice than would be the case if they were known, as they usually are, to be sitting in their bedrooms rather pathetically in the corner, tapping away on their laptops or their phones. So I think the more we build resilience amongst our young people actually in schools to prepare themselves to understand that torrents of abuse like this can in fact represent only a tiny number of people, but also very much building on the education, the cultural attitudes that we're seeking to address through RSHE education in schools to ensure that people understand the principles of tolerance, of kindness, of being able to debate without hatred. You know, there are many ways of tackling racism. I look forward to debating them in the months and years to come, but we don't need to take chunks out of each other whilst we're so debating.
And I suspend the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business. Order. Before I call the Secretary of State, I wish to make a short statement about the sub judice resolution. I have been advised that there are active legal proceedings on the legality of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the active legal proceedings and open inquest in relation to historic troubles-related deaths. I am exercising the discretion given to the Chair in respect of the resolution on matters of sub judice to allow full reference to the challenge to the Northern Ireland Protocol as it concerns issues of national importance. Further, I am exercising the discretion to allow limited reference to active legal proceedings and open inquest in relation to the historic troubles-related deaths. However, references to these cases should be limited to the context and to the events which led to the cases, but not to the detail of cases themselves, nor the names of those involved in them. All honourable members should, however, be mindful of the matters which may be the subject of future legal proceedings and should exercise caution in making reference to individual cases. I also wish to say something further about the actions of yesterday of the Honourable Member for Foyle in naming somebody apparently subject to an anonymity order. As members of this House, we enjoy freedom of speech. As Erskine May states, a member may state whatever they think fit in debate, and that the member is protected by parliamentary privilege. From any action of defamation, as well as from any other question of molestation, this freedom extends to statements which is made out of Parliament. Would breach the injunctions, although this has been deprecated by the Speaker. Freedom of speech must, however, be used responsibly. It is a great step to use privilege to breach a court order, as the Joint Committee on Privacy and Injunctions made clear. Privilege places significant responsibility on parliamentarians to exercise it in the public interest. The presumption should be that court orders are respected in Parliament, and that when a member does not comply with one, he or she can demonstrate that it is in the public interest. It is for others to judge whether or not the actions of the Honourable Member for Foyle were indeed in the public interest. However, the Honourable Member broke no rules of the order, as his comments were made while the House was considering the Armed Forces Bill, and the sub judice rule does not apply when legislation is in question. Finally, before I call the Secretary of State, I have to deprecate the fact that once again a statement appears to have been extensively briefed to the media before made to this House. This is not acceptable. This is not the way we want to do business, and I've got to say the number of texts and emails I've had on this, that members who take a very keen interest, are very supportive of this issue, are quite rightly disappointed that it seems more important that newspapers are the one that carries it, not this House. So can I say once again, and I say to all Secretaries of State and all departments, this House must hear that statement first, not briefing to the newspaper 24 hours before. So please, look and listen. If not, it will be much more difficult, as we'll grant new queues every day to bring that department to this dispatch box. So please, let's work together and let's respect members of this House and those who have got, and quite rightly, are very concerned and want to make sure they're involved in the statement first. And I now call the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My apologies to you and to the House, and I accept the comments you have made. I would just say in defence of myself and colleagues who have been working on this issue for the last 18 months or so, that obviously we've been having wide engagement on a range of issues that inform the statement I'm going to make. And the first time anybody will hear or have seen this statement, apart from the advanced copies we gave to colleagues earlier, as per normal protocol, is as per has always been done, not to the press, Mr. Speaker. And actually, I think it has been important in the last few weeks and months and in the weeks ahead to have that wide engagement with people around the issues that we are talking about because of the complexity and sensitivity. And I would like to make a statement about the way forward in addressing the legacy of Northern Ireland's past. The Troubles did see a terrible, extensive period of violence that claimed the lives of some 3,500 people, left up to 40,000 people injured and caused untold damage to all aspects of society in Northern Ireland. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998 sought to move Northern Ireland forward, setting a bold and a visionary path that would guide all the people of Northern Ireland towards a shared, stable, peaceful and prosperous future. It is wonderful to mark in this centenary year just how far Northern Ireland has come. While Northern Ireland is undoubtedly today a fantastic place to live and to work and visit, the unresolved legacy of the Troubles remains. It continues to impact and permeate society in Northern Ireland. The past is a constant shadow over those who directly experienced the horrors of those times, and also over those who did not, but who now live with the trauma of previous generations. It is clear that the current system for dealing with the legacy of the Troubles is not working. It is now a difficult, in fact a painful truth that the focus on criminal investigations is increasingly unlikely to deliver successful criminal justice outcomes. But all the while, it continues to divide communities and it fails to obtain answers for a majority of victims and families. This is borne out in the figures. The Police Service of Northern Ireland are currently considering almost 1,200 cases, which represents just a fraction of the 3,500 deaths and wider cases. These would have taken over 20 years to investigate. More than 2/3 of Troubles-related deaths occurred over 40 years ago, and it is increasingly difficult for the courts to provide families with the answers they are seeking. If we fail to act now, to properly address, acknowledge and account for the legacy of the Troubles, we will be condemning current and future generations to yet further division, preventing reconciliation at both the individual and societal level. Mr. Speaker, that is why I am today laying before this House and publishing a paper that proposes a series of measures to address the legacy of the past in Northern Ireland. These proposals are being considered as part of an ongoing and an important engagement process, which I announced alongside the Irish Government at the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference last month. As set out in the framework, which we published at the same time, this engagement process is committed to involving not just the UK and Irish governments and the Northern Ireland parties, but also those directly affected by the Troubles and experts and members and committees of this House and the other place. The objective of this engagement is to deal with legacy issues in a way that supports information recovery and reconciliation, complies fully with international human rights obligations and responds to the needs of individual victims and survivors as well as society as a whole. This is a hugely difficult and complex issue, and many have strongly held and divergent views on how to move forward. But we can all agree that I hope we can all agree that this is an issue that is of the utmost importance to the people of Northern Ireland and beyond. It is critical that all involved continue to engage in a spirit of collaboration in order to deliver practical solutions on this most sensitive of issues. This government reaffirms its commitment to intensive engagement in this spirit, and we are committed to introducing legislation by the end of this autumn. The measures set out in the paper will include 3 key proposals. Firstly, a new independent body that will focus on the recovery and provision of information about Troubles-related deaths and most serious injuries. This body will be focused on helping families to find out the truth of what's happened to their loved ones. Where families do not want the past raked over again, they would be able to make this clear. For those families that want to get answers, the body will have the full powers to seek access to information and find out what's happened. A package of measures will also include a major oral history initiative, consistent with what was included in the Stormont House Agreement. This initiative would create opportunities for people from all backgrounds to share their experiences and perspectives related to the Troubles, and crucially, to learn about those of others. Balance and sensitivity would be of central importance, and a concerted effort would be made to engage with those whose voices may not have been heard previously. And thirdly, a statute of limitations, to apply equally to all Troubles-related incidents. We know that the prospect of the end of criminal prosecutions will be difficult for some to accept, and this is not a position that we take lightly. But we have come to the view that this is the best and only way to facilitate an effective information retrieval and provision process, and the best way to help Northern Ireland move further along the road to reconciliation. It is in reality a painful recognition of the very reality of where we are. And as I say, these issues are complex and they are sensitive. That is why they remain unresolved 23 years after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. And we also understand the importance of the Stormont House Agreement and remain committed to its key principles, which this paper will outline and cover. In particular, we acknowledge that any proposal that moves away from criminal justice outcomes would be a very significant step that will be extremely difficult for some families to accept. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement was a bold step, one to address the past, and there have been other such bold steps, such as the decommissioning of weapons and the limiting of sentences all those years ago to 2 years. However, it is increasingly clear to us that the ongoing retributive criminal justice processes are far from helping, in fact impeding the successful delivery of information recovery, mediation and reconciliation that could provide a sense of restorative justice for many more families than is currently the case. The government is committed to doing all in its power to ensure that families from across the United Kingdom do not continue to be let down by a process which leads only to pain, suffering and disappointment for the vast majority. As part of this, we will deliver on our commitment to veterans who served in Northern Ireland. We will provide certainty for former members of the security forces, many of whom remain fearful of the prospect of being the subject of ongoing investigations that will hang over them for years to come, even though the vast majority acted in accordance with the law and often at great personal risk. We are also unequivocal in our commitment to delivering for victims and survivors. Time is crucial, and as it moves on, we risk the very real possibility that we will lose any chance to get the vital information that families want and need. They have waited long enough, and a focus on information would offer the best chance of giving more families some sense of justice through acknowledgement, accountability and restorative means. We need to progress our understanding of the complexity of the Troubles, and in doing so, seek to reconcile society with the past as we go on to look forward together. This government is determined to address all aspects of Northern Ireland's troubled past. We know from our recent history, particularly with the implementation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, that we can achieve more when we are bold and move forward together. And I want us all to continue to engage on the shape and the detail of the proposals as we work to address this issue, which is of the utmost importance to the people of Northern Ireland and beyond. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would just draw the attention of the House to a quote from Margaret Fairless Barber. I came across it in reading the report by Lord Eames and Dennis Bradley into Northern Ireland's past, and I think it's just worth repeating today in this House. To look backward for a while is to refresh the eye, to restore it, and to render it more fit for its prime function of looking forward. I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Louise Hake.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement, but share your frustration, Mr. Speaker, that the government has repeatedly chosen to brief newspapers rather than respecting this House and, more importantly, the victims which these proposals concern. Mr. Speaker, in debates around Northern Ireland's past here in Great Britain, it is all too easy to forget the victims of the conflict. People like Brian Service, who was just 35 years old when he was shot in the head by loyalist paramilitaries in a random sectarian attack just weeks before the Good Friday Agreement. After his death, his mother said she felt he never really existed as a person, as though his life and death did not matter. The deep pain of that conflict was the proximity of the violence and the absence of justice. Over 3,000 people lost their lives, tens of thousands injured in a place of less than 2 million. Society, the peace process in general, remains so fragile precisely because the pain runs so deep. It is why any proposal to deal with legacy must have victims and the communities of Northern Ireland at its heart. And that requires real care from the Secretary of State. So it is deeply regrettable that his approach has already seen trust among victims reach rock bottom. Victims have been treated appallingly over the last 18 months. Promises made, torn up, gaslighted by this Secretary of State at this dispatch box. Little wonder that many have greeted today's proposals with deep scepticism and question whether it is more an exercise in shoring up narrow party support than it is in delivering the reconciliation communities in Northern Ireland crave. Because we must not forget that this government gave victims their word. Just 18 months ago, they promised to legislate on the Stormont House Agreement in New Decade, New Approach. These proposals are a seismic departure from that promise. If the goal is reconciliation, why would the Secretary of State begin by taking a sledgehammer to promises made by his own government? And I'm afraid to dress this up as truth and reconciliation is deeply disingenuous. These proposals as they stand will deliver neither. You cannot impose reconciliation, and the truth will never out with an amnesty in place. Because at the heart of these proposals is an amnesty in all but name, which is profoundly offensive to many. No wonder that the 5 main political parties in Northern Ireland have objected to these proposals, as have victim groups right across the spectrum: SEF, WAVE, Relatives for Justice. Crimes committed in the United Kingdom, the vast majority of which relate to Republican and Loyalist murder, closed for good. No justice for the Bloody Sunday families whose cases remain live. No justice for the 21 innocent people murdered by IRA bombs on a November night in Birmingham in 1974, the deadliest act of terror in Britain until 7/7. Their families have said today that such an amnesty would be abhorrent. And as veterans of the Ulster Defence Regiment, who I met with in Cookstown, told me, we have nothing to hide. We were there to protect the rule of law. If we broke it, use it against us. If we didn't, defend us with it. Ministers today appear to have concluded that the rule of law no longer applies. An amnesty for the Republican and Loyalist terrorists who tortured, maimed, disappeared and murdered men, women and children. Addressing the toxic legacy of the past in this way, through unilateral imposition from Westminster, without the support of any political party in Northern Ireland, is foolish and unsustainable. A way forward has to be found, one done with people, not to them, that genuinely prioritises reconciliation and upholds the rule of law. It is striking that the Secretary of State made scant reference to the government's obligations under Article 2 to conduct effective investigations. If his proposals are not legal, they will be tied up in the courts for many years to come. And the work of Operation Canova is demonstrating that even now, many years on, important new evidence can be retrieved. The case for a comprehensive legacy process, as outlined in Stormont House, through investigations with full police powers, remains strong and compelling. It is totally wrong to abandon it. In closing, Mr. Speaker, I would say the Secretary of State's deliberations concern the most shattering moments, the midnight hour of some of the darkest days seen on these islands. They concern whether families for whom the violence was so intimate have the chance of coming to terms with what happened to their loved ones. I would urge him, in his deliberations, to ask himself whether society's interests are truly served by an amnesty, or whether it is in his own party's interests that he is serving. This is the last chance for many victims to find the truth. The decisions the Secretary of State takes could be the last word. On this issue, more than any other, those most affected by the dark legacy of the past must come first.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to addressing, as I said, the unresolved legacy of Northern Ireland's past, so that communities can reconcile and heal. That is what the command paper that we will publish today sets out, and I would suggest the Honourable Lady has a look at that to see that some of the issues that she has raised are issues we've been talking to people about and issues that we cover in that command paper. Clearly, as I've said before, anything we do, we are determined to ensure is Article 2 compliant. And I would just point out to the Honourable Lady, she used the reference of Operation Canova, which has done excellent work, working with victims and families to get to the bottom of truth. In the 4 or 5 years that's been functioning, of course, no prosecutions. But there is a model in Operation Canova about how these things can work, and it's a very clear indication how you can get to information in a way as we move forward. And that's the kind of process that I think would be constructive for us to be looking at and dealing with. And I would just say to the Honourable Lady, in terms of Stormont House, it is increasingly clear, and I've been frank with the House about that in my opening remarks, that any approach to dealing with the legacy of the past that focuses on criminal investigations will be unlikely to deliver the outcomes that people hope for. There is a point at which we in this House need to be honest with people about the very painful, difficult reality of where we are today, and as cases that we've seen recently have shown us. And that is probably why one of the previous police ombudsmen of Northern Ireland themselves made the comment that some of those things were simply unworkable. And we are also very clear that we will never accept any moral equivalence between those who upheld the law in Northern Ireland, who served their country, and those on all sides who sought to destroy it. And I would just gently say to the Honourable Lady that while she stands here and talks about engagement, some of the people that she has criticised as not engaging with, in fact we were engaging with just last week, along a wide range of engagement that has gone over the last 18 months and will continue. This is intended, this paper, as part of the talks that are ongoing at the moment and will continue in the weeks ahead. And in light of not hearing from the Honourable Lady a single thing about what the Labour Party would propose as a way forward, I would finish as I did in my opening statement with a quote. Instead of releasing the sort of politics that can ensure the success of the Good Friday Agreement, the party is an obstacle to progressive political development. That's a quote from Boyd Black, today, the Secretary of the Labour Party in Northern Ireland.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement enabled peace to come to Northern Ireland and opened up the prospect of a much brighter future for that part of the United Kingdom. But does my right honourable friend agree that young people today and future generations will only be able to enjoy that brighter future if Northern Ireland can find a path to reconciliation and is able to address and, crucially, move on from the legacy of the past?
So state.
Yes, my right honourable friend, who I know has had a great interest in Northern Ireland for many, many years, is absolutely right. It cannot be right that 23 years on from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, still only some 7% of children in Northern Ireland are able to enjoy integrated education. If we want to see society move forward, we need to be clear and honest with ourselves about there is much more work to do on that. And she is absolutely right. We need to end the intergenerational trauma that we are seeing and find a way to help Northern Ireland move forward in the future so that the next generation and today's younger generation can look forward whilst always understanding where we've come from and what has happened, but have the ability to look forward.
Richard Thompson, SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with your remarks at the start of this session about the unfortunate way that this information has entered into the public domain. However it is, and while I thank that happened, and while I thank the Secretary of State for the advance sight of his statement, we shouldn't be reading these things on the BBC and RTE websites before we're able to discuss them in the House. Mr. Speaker, allow me to acknowledge first of all, the untidy and imperfect nature of some of the compromises that have had to be made over the decades. First of all, to achieve peace in Northern Ireland and then to maintain it. But whatever merits there might be in principle in proposals surrounding aspects of truth, reconciliation and ensuring that the hidden truths of the Troubles are at last able to be told while it's still possible to do so, there still remain huge concerns about the lack of formal consultation and engagement that there appears to have been over these proposals. Could I ask the Secretary of State, does he understand the huge concern and the unease and the upset that these proposals for a statute of limitations will cause, not just across Northern Ireland, but right across these islands? Will he acknowledge that unease and commit to engage with victims groups and political leaders to discuss the way forward? And will he also think again about that statute of limitations and find a way to ensure that whatever final proposals he brings forward to this House, that wherever independent prosecutors consider that there is a sufficiency of evidence, a likelihood of successful conviction, and where, importantly, they also independently judge that it is in the public interest to bring forward a prosecution, that they will still be able to do so.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would say to the honourable gentleman, I absolutely agree with him around the issue around making sure that we're able to get to the truth, get to information. We cannot, nobody in this House can ever want to see again a situation where, as we have done recently with the families in the Ballymurphy case, have had to wait 50 years to get to the truth. We've got to find a better way forward. The current system is failing everybody. So to do nothing simply isn't an option that is going to deliver for people in Northern Ireland. And he's absolutely right. We do want to engage. We have been engaging, not just over the last 18 months, but even just last week, myself and my officials engaging with victims groups on these very issues. And in the weeks ahead, with this command paper for people to be able to read through, look at and get engaged with, that engagement will continue, as well as with the political parties and indeed our partners in the Irish Government.
Let's go to the Chair of the Select Committee, Simon Hoare. Simon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend should be commended for trying once again, as others have tried, to resolve legacy. And as we do so, can we resolve not to use the language, I know he hasn't, of drawing a line and closing a chapter? For those who suffer still, that is something unreachable, and we need to show utmost sensitivity on those points. Mr. Speaker, the work of Operation Canova has commanded cross-community support. Where does that model and approach fit in my right honourable friend's thinking as he tries to pursue truth and reconciliation? How will he evolve these plans working in concert with the Irish government in order to ensure and maximise buy-in for a joint approach? And is there a George Mitchell-like figure hovering in the wings who could be deployed to help to act as an honest broker as we try to resolve this all too long issue?
Chief State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the comments of the Chairman of the Select Committee. There is a lot of work to do with our partners, not just victims and veterans, who are also, of course, often get scared of victims of the troubles themselves in a wide sense as well, and directly in some cases, and the parties in Northern Ireland, but also the Irish Government. There are still a range of cases that I know exist that the First Minister of Northern Ireland not that long ago wrote to the Taoiseach about, and that's why we want to make sure we are looking at how we can work together to ensure that as we look at information recovery, we find a way to do this that gets the truth, gets to information that we have not yet been able to secure in a process that works for families and victims. I do think Operation Canova is a very, very good example of how you can show that you can get to the truth, you can get information in a format that hasn't been had before. We need to accept the difficult reality of over the last 5 years, it's not yet seen any successful prosecutions, but the model of how they've worked and worked with victims and with families, I think is an important part of the discussions to have around information recovery. And I share with him the view that this is never about ignoring what has happened. We shouldn't do that. It would be wrong to do that. We have to be conscious of our past in order to be able to understand and learn more about where we can go for our future. And that has to be the aim for people and the young generation of people in Northern Ireland in the future.
We now come to Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know this is a difficult issue, and the Secretary of State is not the first to attempt to address these matters. And I think we all have to take responsibility for the failure since 1998 to deal effectively with this matter. Today, Mr. Speaker, on the 14th of July in 1984, two of my comrades in the Ulster Defence Regiment, Private Norman McKinley and Corporal Heather Kerrigan, were murdered by the IRA near Castlederg in a landmine explosion. I think also today, even of members of this House who lost their lives during the Troubles, people like Erin Neve, murdered in the precincts of this House, and for whom no one has been brought to justice. I think of the Reverend Robert Bradford, the member for South Belfast, murdered in his advice centre, for whom no one has been brought to justice. Like the former Prime Minister, I want to take the path to reconciliation, but I cannot believe that the path to reconciliation is made easier when we sacrifice justice. And I think that the victims have to be at the centre of this. And I would urge the Secretary of State, in taking forward his proposals, to listen to their voices. This must be a victim-centred process. It cannot be at their expense. I want Northern Ireland to move forward. I want that young generation to see a Northern Ireland that looks to the future and not living in the past. But the rule of law is important, and upholding the rule of law after all that we've been through in Northern Ireland is important. Justice is important. Yes, truth is important as well. But I think the Secretary of State, Mr. Speaker, needs now to reassure the victims that they will be part of the discussion of these proposals, that their quest for justice will not be ignored.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. Victims must be a huge, an important part of this process. As I say, I know we were engaged with organisations such as WAVE, and I met with the South East Fermanagh Foundation myself just last week, and their stories and those of others that I've met and talked to are moving, and in cases, as he will know, and many in this House will know, harrowing. And he's right to talk about members of this House and members of my party who obviously have been victims. I noticed the comments this morning, I think powerful comments from Lord Tebbit as well around his views of this. And it's right that we have victims in our mind. And as I say, we often forget that many of those who served, as he rightly outlines, are also victims and close to victims as well. And that's why taking this thoughtful approach, as he outlines, I think is absolutely right. I think it's why it's right that there is a point at which we need to be honest with people and deal with that very painful reality of where we are and what is achievable for people, and acknowledging the reality of where we are with retributive justice following the Sentencing Act that followed the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and actually looking at restorative justice and reconciliation as a way forward, and how do we facilitate getting to the information, to get to accountability, to get to truth, and to get to reconciliation. We think this is a way forward. We think this is after so many years of looking at this is the right way forward, but I look forward to having that discussion and debate with him and with others.
Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For many families who've lost loved ones during the Troubles, the chances of achieving a criminal justice outcome is vanishingly small, and that is leading, understandably, to pain, to suffering and to disappointment. And even despite that, for many, then the proposal to apply a statute of limitations is going to be extremely difficult to accept. So will my right honourable friend assure me that he's working with communities on all sides to ensure that everybody's voice is heard?
So state.
Yes, I can absolutely give that assurance. We have been over the last 18 months, both with wider civic society as well. We were certainly in the intensive talks that began after the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference on the 24th of June and therefore started effectively last week. The week before last will continue for the next few weeks. We will certainly be doing that.
We come to the columnist with the member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In October 1990, Patsy Gillespie was abducted from his home by the IRA. His family were told he would be back soon, whilst being held at gunpoint. Patsy was then chained to the driver's seat of a van filled with explosives and forced at gunpoint to drive that van to a nearby army base. The IRA then remotely detonated that bomb, killing Patsy and 5 soldiers. Will the Secretary of State come with me and explain to his widow, Kathleen, why he wants to protect his killers from prosecution and even investigation?
Secretary of State.
Well, look, I appreciate the honourable gentleman tends to, in this House, as we saw yesterday, use emotive comments for sound bites, often for his own social media outlet. What I would say to you is to use somebody's harrowing experience and loss in that way, I think says much about him. I would happily meet with any victim to talk to them about the experience they've been through and why we need to be honest with them about what is achievable and how we help Northern Ireland move forward in a positive way, rather than continuing to use harrowing experiences like that for political end in the way that he has done in the last 24 hours.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome your opening statement, particularly about the way that this information came out today? Can I also say to the House that many years ago I was called to serve in Northern Ireland. I didn't ask to go, and it was a terrible thought that I had to carry a rifle in amongst members and citizens of the United Kingdom. I, like many others, lost a friend. Robert Nairac was taken prisoner, captured, tortured, murdered, and his body has never been found. And his parents died never knowing where he was or what happened to him. And the Good Friday Agreement, with its associations, and also the letters of comfort that followed, have meant pretty much that many of us have accepted now, sadly, that we will never really know the truth about what happened to that brave man. And so I simply say today that this process, which is 4 years in the making, and I do upbraid the Secretary of State for not having brought forward legislation, at least give us an idea of what they are planning. But I do say to my right honourable friend that this will not be beloved of anybody. But I recognise sincerely, that if we are to move forward, we will all have to make some kind of sacrifice. My only concern is that the vexatious pursuit of soldiers who served like many of us did, because that's what their country called them to do, should end, and they themselves be seen as victims.
Secretary of State.
Well, my honourable friend makes a powerful point, and obviously he'll appreciate, I know about obviously the Robert Nyrak case is a very good example of where we've not been able to get to information, and actually why it is important to try and work with our partners, both with the Irish government and potentially in the United States as well, around how we can actually find a way forward that delivers information in a way we've just not been able to do so far, and what is it that allows us to step forward and do that. And as I say, I think these proposals give us the basis for doing that. I also think he makes a very powerful point, and I absolutely accept his point about legislation. Both himself, my honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh, the member for North Dun, and others around this House have for a very, very long time made the case for needing to move this issue forward, and I absolutely accept that they want to see that done and see that delivered as quickly as possible. And he makes a very important point, which I made, I alluded to early on in my comments, and I think it is worth making again, and I support his very, very strong, powerful point. Those who serve their country with honour, to protect life, to protect their country, are victims as well, and have just as an important voice in this as anybody else in looking at how we move things forward for the people of Northern Ireland.
Let's go to Stephen Farry. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. These shameful proposals are an insult to all victims and indeed to many veterans who served honourably. They don't draw a line, but rather they cross the line on justice and the rule of law. It is staggering that the government is contemplating an amnesty, including for IRA and loyalist terrorists, in order to address this false narrative of vexatious investigations into veterans. There's near universal disapproval of these proposals in Northern Ireland. So can the Secretary of State give an assurance that he will not seek to impose these one-sided proposals over the heads of local political parties in Northern Ireland and indeed victims groups across the spectrum?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Look, I would just say to honourable gentlemen, as I said earlier on, there is a very important, and I appreciate for some it can be now, but there is an important difference in why this is a statute of limitations. We are not pardoning terrorists for the heinous crimes that they committed. We are very clear as a government, we will never accept any moral equivalence between those who upheld the law and served their country and the citizens of Northern Ireland and those on all sides who sought to destroy it. I absolutely do want to find a way to work through this with people in Northern Ireland, parties, civic society and representatives of the victims groups and victims themselves to find a way forward. And I would say to him to look carefully at what we're talking about and engage positively around how we are looking to deal with information recovery in a way that means we can get to the truth, and with truth comes accountability, in a way that in the last 23 years has failed everybody. There has to be a better way of doing this. I think there's a duty on all of us to find it.
Okay, we go by video link to Richard Drax.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Having served on 3 operational tours, I have some knowledge of the province and more about the ongoing witch hunt of our veterans. Of course, I welcome any move to try and end this injustice. But I'm afraid I don't believe that former terrorists on both sides of the sectarian divide will now participate in a truth recovery process if indeed I've understood my right honourable friend correctly. This is not South Africa. Does my right honourable friend agree that it's time for the long-awaited and frequently discussed and promised bill, not further discussions?
Secretary of State.
Well, I do recognise, as I said to my honourable friend, the member for Woodford Green, I do recognise the desire from colleagues to see legislation, and they will see legislation before the end of the autumn. I would have liked to bring legislation forward earlier, but I think it is important. We are working with our partners, not just in the Irish government, as I've outlined earlier on, but parties, interested parties and political parties in Northern Ireland to find a way forward if we can. This paper is intended to inform those discussions in the next few weeks and over the next few weeks so we can find a mutual way forward. I have to say one of the challenges with the situation we have at the moment, and I do recognise his point around who will and will not come forward with information, is at the moment that information is not coming forward. So if we don't find a way of doing something different, we are sadly in a position where, because of time, that information will no longer be with us. So it is time, we believe, to do something bold and different to find a way forward that can get to the truth as far as we can, to get answers for families who have waited for far too long, as well as helping Northern Ireland move forward.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State's statement today is a quite remarkable achievement. I've followed Northern Ireland politics all my adult life, and I think I can think of very few occasions where Secretaries of State in this place have been able to unite all 5 parties in Northern Ireland. But the Secretary of State today has achieved exactly that. They are, however, all united in telling him that on the question of an amnesty, he is wrong. He stands at the dispatch box today and says that he makes no moral equivalence between those who broke the law and those who uphold it. Why then is he offering them all legal equivalence?
Secretary of State.
Well, I'm sure people would have asked our predecessors those sort of questions with the equivalence that came from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement under the Labour government back at the time of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the Sentencing Act that followed that. That is the reality of where we are. My difficult, why I refer to this, there is a difficult, painful reality of where we are, the situation we are in, the reality of not seeing prosecutions, and painfully being honest with victims about what is achievable. And in actually the conversation I know Operation Canova has had and I've had, when people talk about, as we've seen in the last 24 hours as well, wanting to get to the truth, get to information, get an understanding, in many cases, of what actually happened, the current system isn't working, and we need to find a different way forward to do something that can make a difference to get to the truth. And that's what we want to achieve with a proper, genuine, delivering information recovery process.
We go by video link to Mark Logan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can the Secretary of State confirm that today is but one part of a process that seeks to get buy-in from both parties and people across the political spectrum in Northern Ireland and engender hope for both current and future generations?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can say to my honourable friend, absolutely. And I don't underestimate, and I do appreciate, as I said in my opening remarks, this is a very, very difficult, sensitive and complex situation. And I appreciate we are asking people to take a very, very big step. That's why we want to engage intensively over the weeks ahead, but we are being very honest with people. We need to do something different. The status quo has failed, and we need to find a different way forward. And I hope we'll be able to do that in the weeks ahead before we legislate in the autumn.
We go by video link to Tony Lloyd.
And thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State, can he honestly think of any circumstance when he would say to the families of victims of murder anywhere else in the United Kingdom, and including Northern Ireland, under different circumstances, that an amnesty is the way that would bring them reconciliation and peace? Because if not, how does he say to the families of victims of the Troubles that this is the correct way forward? And far from practically meaning that we move towards reconciliation, he's set up another wave, if he carries on with this, of intercommunal unhappiness, and that cannot be the way forward.
Secretary of State.
Well, I do agree with the Honourable Gentleman. It's the desire to end, the intergenerational challenge and trauma that we are seeing with families now and people now who are with us who were simply not alive at the time of the Troubles and have no recollection of just how dreadful a situation that was for Northern Ireland. We need to stop this intergenerational issue. And I was saying in direct answer to his question that the Troubles does represent a uniquely troubled time in our history. The Good Friday Belfast Agreement itself acknowledged that in focusing on a shared future for Northern Ireland. We sometimes do need to make difficult decisions in relation to the past, as his colleagues did and as our colleagues did back at the time of the Belfast Agreement. We are in a different situation in Northern Ireland with the Troubles to most other crimes because of the Sentencing Act that followed the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. We need to be honest about that and deal with the reality of where we are, however difficult that may be.
James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've had the privilege of working closely alongside the Secretary of State on legacy for much of the past 6 months, and I do believe he is onto something. This is difficult work and it involves compromise, so I am slightly baffled both today and previously by some of the negativity that I've encountered with regards to the statute, because I think we in Westminster have a responsibility to get behind him. So does my right honourable friend agree that his emerging statute will not just unpick and end this unpalatable cycle of vexatious behaviour, but will also help to create a strategic environment in Northern Ireland whereby truth, reconciliation and alternative forms of dispute resolution can flourish for the benefit of future peace and stability?
Secretary of State.
Well, I want to thank the Honourable Gentleman for his comments and experience that he has shared with our department over the last period, with his huge experience of serving in the armed forces and in Northern Ireland, the reality on the ground. And look, he's absolutely right. The focus has to be, and our intention is absolutely as he outlined, to find a way ultimately to ensure that people in Northern Ireland, families can get to the truth, those families who want it, and as a wider society in Northern Ireland, we can share and understand what happened and find a way to look forward to the future in a positive way.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for coming to the House to make a statement? Just put it on record, the DUP do not support an amnesty for terrorist killers at all. Can the Secretary of State understand why legacy issues leave a bitter taste in the mouths of so many in the province who have seen hundreds of millions spent on inquiry after inquiry to ostensibly further the Republican agenda, to rewrite history, to make their abhorrent atrocities seem acceptable? There can be no equivalence whatsoever between the soldier and the police officer who served their country and those cowardly terrorists who hid behind masks and terrorised under the cover of darkness. We find, honestly, any such attempted equivalence as offensive, deeply offensive to us.
Secretary of State.
Look, I absolutely understand the point the Honourable Gentleman is making with clarity and passion, as I know he has done before. But obviously, as I said, the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the Sentencing Act that followed that created legally an equivalence in the sense of how you deal legally with the troubles of the past, certainly in terms of sentencing, and that's the reality we are dealing with. And this is why I make the point that there is absolutely no question that we would ever accept a moral equivalence between those who served their country, protected life, and put themselves at risk, obviously, clearly for many suffering injury and loss of life as well, and hence why I agree with my honourable friend's comment earlier on about many of those who served are victims as well. There is no moral equivalence between that and those terrorists who put Northern Ireland through a period of dark, as the Honourable Lady rightly outlined, a dark and dreadful period of the troubles that are preventing Northern Ireland from moving forward in an economic way that we are still seeing the fallout from today. And that is why, some 23 years on from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, I think we do need to be honest about the difficult reality of that, what that means, and what we need to do to take that big step to look at how we move forward and free society and the young of today and tomorrow to move forward in a positive way, but never forgetting the past of what happened.
Mark Francois.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I say to the Secretary of State, more in sorrow than in anger, after 4 years of promising to do something about this, after 2 general election manifestos, after endless promises at the dispatch box, not just from him, but from the Prime Minister himself, and after he privately assured the Veterans Support Group many weeks ago that we would see the second reading of a bill by the summer recess, what do we have today? We have a consultation document. And then he's promised to introduce legislation by the end of the autumn. That means first reading by Christmas. This will undoubtedly be a controversial bill, so that means we'll be lucky to get it onto the statute book by next summer. So our veterans, many of them in the autumn of their lives, many of them in ill health, will still have to undergo the sword of Damocles for at least another year. I say to our procrastinating Secretary of State, you are the boy who cried wolf once too often. Here's my question. After 4 years of this, where's your bill, Brandon?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I think my honourable friend has just outlined and highlighted the seriousness with which we are taking our engagement. And I think the very fact that he's quite right. I did want to, as I said earlier on this afternoon in this statement, I would have liked to have brought legislation before this House before the summer recess. I had committed to update this House on where we were back in January, February before the summer recess, which is what we were doing. But I would have liked to have brought forward a second reading of a bill before the summer recess. But, as I say, the reality is the Irish Government had agreed to come into talks with us. We agreed that formally on the 24th of June. I think that's a very important and positive step. I do think it's important that we work together on that with the parties in Northern Ireland and wider civil society, and the victims groups and veterans groups as well. And the fact that we have put off taking legislation forward at this point in time, I think highlights our credentials for the fact that we do want to engage on this and find a way forward for people and with people in Northern Ireland. I absolutely accept his point around how long this has taken and the determination. I know the dogged determination he has shown over a very, very long period of time to deliver for veterans in Northern Ireland, as well as more widely. I am determined that we will end the cycle of investigations for veterans, which has gone on for far too long. He is right about that. And the proof of me, and I've heard his quote a couple of times now, I'll have to take that on the chin until I can prove him otherwise, in fact, by bringing forward legislation that can ensure that we end this cycle of investigations that is unfairly treating our veterans, that is serving nobody, and ensuring we have a system at the moment in Northern Ireland that is not getting to the truth, that is not getting to information, and therefore is not allowing that society to move forward and reconcile in the future. All of that has to come together as a package. We're determined to do that in partnership with people and to do that at speed.
We go by video link to Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Is it the case that vexatious complaints are only half the story? That the outcome of inquests, the outcome of the Canova investigation, if they propose that there should be trials, that they are now, as of today, redundant? And can the Secretary of State confirm if cases against people like Rita O'Hare, cases against John Downey, cases against Owen Caron, are those cases because they are already live? Do they cease to exist and do those people get off scot-free? Can I confirm to the House what is the true outcome of today's proposals?
Secretary of State.
Well, the Honourable Gentleman has just highlighted some of the challenges with how you deal with these issues and move forward in this difficult reality that I outlined. I would just say to him, as we're working through in the weeks ahead, some of the details around this are the details we need to work through, including talking to, as I say, victims groups and political parties, people such as himself, to make sure we take this on board so that when we do legislate, we're able to do so in a way that isn't just able to help Northern Ireland move forward, but make sure that it deals with everything in a genuinely holistic way, so that if we say we're going to end this cycle of investigations that is serving nobody and is acting unfairly, that we actually are able to ensure we do so properly.
Tanmanjeet Singh Dassi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Margaret Valenti was just 30 years old in 1980 when her husband was abducted by the Provisional IRA, held captive for 3 days before being murdered. 10 years later, her son-in-law was brutally murdered by the UVF, and to this day, she has no idea whether there was a thorough investigation into either murder. So how can the Secretary of State stand there and say that the answer to this staggering failure of justice for Margaret and hundreds like her is to completely close the book altogether and to cruelly deny her any chance of finding the truth about what happened to her loved ones? And would Conservative ministers be so insensitive about coming up with such ludicrous legislation if a member of their own family was such a victim?
Secretary of State.
Well, I would just say to the Honourable Gentleman that he's just highlighted the fact that he hasn't really paid any attention to what we've been talking about and what has been, and he clearly is not up to speed with what we've been talking about with parties and victims groups and veterans around what these proposals are. I would suggest he has a look at the command paper, because quite the opposite is true. The very fact that those victims have not been able to get to the truth is the issue we need to deal with, and it's why the information recovery part of this is so important in going forward. I'd suggest he looks carefully at the command paper, looks again at what I said in my opening statement, before standing up and making a comment that is so far from the truth that it almost doesn't really bear answering.
And finally, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend accept that these proposals are practically identical to those put forward by the Defence Committee in its report of April 2017? Does he also accept that the time will never come when there will be agreement by all parties, and that it is up to government to decide what it's going to do and do it? Does he accept that the vexatious pursuit of soldiers cannot be stopped without a statute of limitations, and a statute of limitations to conform with international law cannot be selective? And finally, does he accept that a truth recovery mechanism fulfills the requirement of international law to have a proper inquiry, and that is the only way that people are going to be likely to reveal what happened when they no longer have to fear prosecution that would in any case almost certainly fail?
Secretary of State.
well, my honourable friend is hugely expertise and experience in these matters. And he's quite right. The Select Committee report is very clear and goes into great detail in terms of how this can work. And he's also absolutely right, as none of us will be surprised, in terms of his understanding, his outline of why it is so important that the information recovery, the truth and the reconciliation part of this is so important, because that is not only how we move Northern Ireland forward, but actually coming back to my opening remarks in my statement earlier this afternoon, it's how we ensure that what we do is compliant with human rights, is Article 2 compliant, and to do that we need to make sure that information recovery is very clear, very focused and able to deliver. And there are examples that we've seen through Operation Canova and others where that can be done. And I want to thank the Honourable Gentleman for the expertise and the advice that he's been able to give from that report and since, but he is absolutely right.
Thank you. I will now suspend the House for 3 minutes in order that arrangements can be made for the next item of business. Order. Order. I call Secretary of State Grant Shapps to make a statement.
Madam Deputy Speaker, transport decarbonisation is a dull way of describing something much more exciting and far-reaching. Because transport is not just about how you get around, it's something much more fundamental. It shapes our towns and our cities and our countryside. Today we're publishing our transport decarbonisation plan, the first in the world, a comprehensive yet urgent strategy to end transport's contribution to climate change within the next 3 decades, showing global leadership as we prepare to host COP26 in November. It's not about stopping people doing things, it's about doing the same things differently. We still want to fly on holiday, but it will be in more efficient aircraft. We will be using sustainable fuel. We still drive our cars on improved roads, but increasing in zero emission. And we'll still have new development and additional housing, for example, but it won't force us into high carbon lifestyles by planning them more carefully. Madam Deputy Speaker, we know the world is running out of time to tackle climate change. Unless we take decisive and radical action now, it will be soon to be too late to prevent catastrophic damage to our planet. And that will also threaten our security and our prosperity. But at the same time, terms such as decarbonisation and net zero seem abstract to many people. This plan argues that transport is not just how you get around, it influences our living standards, in fact, our whole quality of life. It can shape all these things, for good or for bad. Bad is traffic congestion and pollution, which also contributes to climate change. Indeed, transport's now the single biggest contributor to UK greenhouse gas emissions. And carbonisation is not just some technocratic process, it's how we fix some of that harm. It's how we make sure that transport shapes the country and the economy in ways that are good. It's about taking filth out of the air and creating better places. It's about a second industrial revolution, creating hundreds of thousands of green jobs in places that were the cradle of the first one. And driving all this will be the consumer, making greener travel choices informed by better data, and government working with industry to meet our carbon budgets and to keep this green transport revolution on track. And what's exciting about the plan is that for the first time we have the opportunity to decarbonise transport without curtailing our freedoms. It won't stop us from driving, commuting to work or going on holiday, but we'll be using zero-emission cars, motorcycles and trucks, we'll be travelling in zero-emission trains, ferries, buses and coaches, we'll be cycling and we'll be walking more and we'll be flying in more efficient aircraft using sustainable aviation fuels. Now, I accept that even a few years ago, this vision we're setting out today would have seemed overambitious. But such is the progress we're making in the country in terms of technology and engineering and building momentum for the net zero challenge ahead and in showing real political leadership for the biggest challenge in our lifetime that we can now commit to a bold strategy to help wean transport off fossil fuels and reach net zero in under 30 years. We've already announced that the sale of new cars and vans powered solely by petrol or by diesel will cease in 2030, and for all cars and vans to be fully zero emission at the tailpipe by 2035. A commitment that would not have been deliverable while we were members of the EU, and this is because our own type approval framework would have breached the single market had we tried. To underpin these phase-out dates, we've today published our 2035 delivery plan, which sets out the investment and the measures from government to deliver mass ownership of zero-emission cars and vans. And we published a green paper, one of 10 different documents which sit alongside this transport decarbonisation plan, which shows our new road vehicle CO2 emissions regulatory framework and which will be ambitious in decarbonising road transport and tailored to UK needs. And this could include, for example, a zero-emission mandate for manufacturers, so they sell an ever-increasing proportion of zero-emission vehicles before they're able to sell any others. But the decarbonisation plan goes further still, with a commitment to consult on a world-leading pledge to phase out sale of all new non-zero emission road vehicles and motorcycles, from motorcycles to HGVs. And we believe this should be done from 2040 at the latest,
And that's a massive step forward towards cleaning up our road transport altogether. And by doing so, we'll remove the source of over 90% of our total domestic transport emissions. But we'll go further, creating a net zero rail network by 2050, replacing all of our diesel-only trains by 2040 with super clean technologies like hydrogen. Hundreds of electric buses are already operating in many UK cities, but soon that will be thousands. And this will not just benefit urban areas, but the whole country, remote and rural areas that have not always been best served by such changes in the past. They'll see the benefits as well this time. Completely clean buses will form the backbone of our local public transport system. And we'll continue to work with industry to roll out a national electric vehicle charging network, as I announced from this dispatch box, nearly 25,000 public charging devices already installed, including more chargers per 100 miles of major key strategic road network than any other country in Europe. And that will include smart vehicle charging to reduce energy bills and when demand for electricity in the system is at its lowest. And something that will also benefit the government would be the government's own fleet of some 40,000 different vehicles, which we aim to have fully electric by 2027. We'll consult on phasing out sales of new, non-zero emission capable domestic ships too. And of course, we'll be a hub for green air travel. Today we've launched a consultation which sets out how we'll deliver net zero aviation by 2050, working with the Jet Zero Council, with a target to achieve zero-emission transatlantic flight within our generation. And if that seems like science fiction, Madam Deputy Speaker, then it's interesting to know that we have already flown the world's first zero-carbon hydrogen aircraft from Cranfield Airport in Bedfordshire. Took a 20-minute flight, another world first for Britain. We'll support and incentivise green development by aligning billions of pounds of infrastructure investment with our net zero programme. Like the billions we're investing to build a thriving electric supply chain, to secure gigafactories here in the UK to create more efficient aviation engines, lighter planes, sustainable fuels, and develop clean freight transport. So just as green transport won't stop us travelling, it certainly won't hold back industry either. In fact, it will open up unparalleled opportunities for new jobs and for enterprise. Just in recent weeks alone, we've seen both Nissan and Vauxhall committed to massive investments in electric vehicle and battery production in Sunderland and in Ellesmere Port. They're the modern-day equivalents of early investments in our railway 200 years ago, or indeed in our fledgling motor industry a century later. What we're seeing here is the start of a second greener industrial revolution, which, just like the first, will be driven by transport. But this time, delivering triple the benefits for our economy, for jobs, and for the future of our planet. But we cannot, of course, simply rely on technology, nor can we believe that zero-emission vehicles will solve all of our problems. They won't, especially in meeting our medium-term targets for 2030s. The pandemic has provided a chance to rethink how we travel. How do we do public transport? In fact, we've already seen a 46% increase in the number of road miles being cycled last year, the biggest increase since the Second World War. And cycling rose by more in a single year than the previous 20 years put together. And with £2 billion of new funding, more than 300 cycling and walking schemes are being delivered, and many more are on their way. We pledged also £3 billion to revolutionise local buses in England outside London, with London-style, cheap, flat fares and integrated ticketing. And, of course, we're creating Great British Railways to bring the railway network back together and make it easier for people to travel by train. We want to make public transport, cycling and walking the natural first choice for who can. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, 2050 may seem like a long way into the future, but it is just 29 years. And that's why the pace of change will be unparalleled, and why this new decarbonisation plan is a landmark in the evolution of the way that we do transport in this country. We're the first country in the world to do this, taking a firm leadership position as we host COP26 later this year in Glasgow. And from being part of the climate change problem to a major part of the solution. That's the transformation we must deliver by 2050, and that's the transformation we will achieve with this transport decarbonisation plan. I'm placing a copy of the plan in the library of the House, and I commend the statement to the House.
Jim McMahon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, can I thank the Secretary of State for advanced sight of his statement. We haven't yet had the joy of reading the plan, although I look forward to seeing it later in the library when I get pointed towards the fiction section, as with most of the strategies produced by the government more recently. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I hope we are coming through the COVID-19 pandemic, we cannot forget that we're still in this climate emergency, nor can we miss the opportunity to kickstart a new green economy built on decent, well-paid and skilled jobs. With transport now the largest contributor to UK emissions, this should have been the chance for ministers to really set out that ambitious plan, which would really lead the way ahead of COP26. Not warm words or re-announcements, but a real plan supporting aviation and maritime, rail and freight, local public transport, alongside active travel. This climate emergency requires urgent action, actually many years ago, yet after a decade in government, I'm afraid they've been found wanting. In the time the government has been in office, the number of petrol and diesel vans has rocketed by 1 million. That's more polluting vans on our roads. And much of that can be attributed to last-mile courier delivery vehicles. Yet the government have been silent on an approach to dealing with that. Under these plans, the government will treat the likes of Amazon, who were boomed during the pandemic, no differently than the self-employed builder, who will take the van at the start of the job, often leaving it parked outside the house until the job is finished. No differentiation at all between those different uses. And today, the average age of a van on the road is the oldest since records began. Nearly 1 million vehicles on the roads are now more than 13 years old. Yet there is no van scrappage scheme, let alone one for cars. All we have on offer is that the government have committed to do what in fact they should be doing already, which is to electrify the entire fleet of government cars and vans by 2027. But how can we trust the government to deliver on this promise when its own transport department has only managed to fully electrify just 2% of its own fleet? And there's nothing to support back in Britain in the future for the economy by making and buying more vehicles here in Britain, as championed by the Shadow Chancellor. Madam Deputy Speaker, he notes that smart electric vehicle charging points are important, but he'll also know there is a woeful lack of them across the country. The government must be ambitious, but it must also genuinely make sure that the investment reaches all parts of the country. So Westminster sees 390 charging points per 100,000 population, 390, compared to just 5.1 for people in Wigan. Numbers on the whole are more charging points. What we find is that there are more charging points in London than the whole of the north of England and the whole of the Midlands combined. So we are not seeing the investment being levelled out in an equal way. So where is the plan to accelerate that and make sure that every part of the country gets its fair share? And although he mentions the zero emission vehicle mandate, it's only nodded to. There's no strong commitment. There's no firm plan in place for achieving that. And aside from the environmental emergency, there is also a clear health emergency. 40,000 people a year die from air-polluted related illnesses. And so we must be leaders in modal shift away from private cars and ambitious on investment in active travel. Yet the government has overseen a reduction of thousands of bus routes. At the same time, ticket prices have rocketed on buses and on trains. The government hasn't even delivered a single one of the 4,000 green buses they've repeatedly promised. And even if they were to deliver on this promise, it's a drop in the ocean and doesn't address the remaining 28,000 buses that won't be replaced under that scheme. And beyond the bus, the Secretary of State talks about long-promised money for cycling, but when's that money going to be spent? Or will be here next year, hearing the same re-announcement? Unless would-be cyclists feel safe, they will not make that shift. The government's own survey reported that 66% of those who responded said that the roads were too dangerous for them to consider cycling on. And moving on to aviation, he wants to get to net zero international aviation emissions by 2050 and 2040 for domestic flights. Why then, Madam Deputy Speaker, is this department planning to cut air passenger duty on those same flights rather than having a targeted sectoral deal that had very firm commitments to decarbonisation built in? As usual, we get more Jet Zero Council consultations, more meetings will come through the pipeline, but where's the action? And the list goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, including the failure to deliver on a genuinely flexible season ticket to get commuters back on our trains. Instead, what we do see is a £1 billion cut from Network Rail's infrastructure budget. And at the same time, fares for passengers are increasing all the time. Now, we were promised an ambitious plan to lead the world ahead of COP26. Madam Deputy Speaker, if that was the test, then I'm afraid the government has failed.
Secretary of State.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm afraid we've been here before a couple of times of late, and I understand the difficulty. For the honourable gentleman. He freely acknowledges he's not actually seen or read this document, and yet he has a stream of criticism for what's inside it, which I find it extraordinary. And rather than taking, I thought, what was quite a detailed statement, so that he could hear all the various different points, instead he read from the preordained script, which claimed that none of the things we're doing were really actually happening. And let's just remind the House, therefore, what actually happened, because I heard him clearly. He mentions that he doesn't think we've been moving fast enough. Let's just check the record. Whilst they were in power, they delivered 63 miles of electrified trains. In the last 3 years, we've done 700 miles in this under this government, just in 3 years. He points to a lack of charging, although I announced in my, actually at the dispatch box a couple of weeks ago and commented on my speech, there were 25,000 public chargers. I should also comment, there are a couple of 100,000 private chargers on top of that. And I am very sorry to hear that Wigan Labour Council has not got enough charging points. I will, on his behalf, this afternoon, ensure that I contact them to make sure they apply for the grants that are available, so we can sort that out for residents in Labour Wigan forthwith. He mentions about zero emissions vehicle mandates. Look, I'm pleased it sounds like there's some agreement on that. The decarbonisation plan discusses it. We also launched a consultation today. I hope you'll agree that you can't simply spring upon the entire sector something as important as a zero mandate. You've got to consult with them first. That's being launched today. There's also another 9 either consultations, technical documents or outcomes from consultations being launched alongside this today. Again, I invite him to read it. I accept that he won't have done at this time, but I think he'll find a lot of his concerns and criticisms are covered. He mentions, for example, that, where are these 4,000 buses? I have some good news for him. It's not that just when one comes along 3, actually not just 3, 900 buses, 900 of them are in production right now. 50 of them are already on the road, 900 of them in production, putting us easily on track to meet our 4,000 by the end of Parliament in production. So good news for him there. He mentions the Jet Zero Council, and he's absolutely right. I make no apology for government meeting with academia, with the sector. We've had our 3rd main Jet Zero Council meeting. There have been dozens of the sub-meetings of the technical working groups. And, what I hear, Madam Deputy Speaker, is the opposition doesn't understand. We've already in this country, thanks to our Jet Zero Council work, flown the world's first hydrogen aircraft. But it's not good enough for them. They still think that we're not doing anything. Good news for him, that aircraft is being upsized to I think a 19-20-seater aircraft, and that's going to be flown shortly, so he won't have to wait long for even more news on that front, along with the electrification of aircraft as well, with the likes of Rolls-Royce and others. I heard what he had to say about rail and usage and increasing usage, particularly coming out of the pandemic. It is a carbon-friendly way to travel. And I heard the criticism that his party laid against the flexible season ticket previously. His stats, Madam Speaker, I'm sure inadvertently, are completely dodgy. What they failed to do was take into account that anybody travelling 2 or 3 days a week would be at least 20% better off when they do that, by comparison to buying a regular ticket or indeed a season ticket. And I saw, and I invite members, I saw his YouTube video on the subject. I will write to him, explaining chapter and verse why he was misquoting stats and information, which I'm pleased he's reminded me of, because it will give me the opportunity to write back to him. And I will, for the purposes of clarity for the whole House, ensure I publish that letter to the House, so that the House is able to judge the stats for themselves. But lastly, Madam Speaker, because I know there are members who want to come in and speak, I've mentioned today, and we're very proud of the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, the 9 or 10 different documents which back this up, the incredible level of detail that's gone into this work. I ask, where is Labour's plan? Where are the detailed plans? Where is the level of technical analysis? Because all I ever hear is, not having read our plan, they don't have their own, and yet they're still up for criticising ours.
Thank you. We go now by video link. To Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. When I was told the Minister had sent the draft final plan back for not being ambitious enough, I actually harboured hopes that this might well be a serious plan to match the seriousness of our times. It will certainly require investment of a scale that the Chancellor won't naturally be disposed to. But sadly, from zero-emission cars and buses to rail, maritime, active travel and aviation, it's the lack of ambition, certainly relative to Scotland, that stands out. Scotland aims to cut car use by 20% by 2030, and we will spend 10% of the transport capital budget on active travel. But for the cars that remain, we have twice as many rapid charging points per head, with 60% of charging points free to use. That's 3 times higher than England's 20%. Meanwhile, this government has halved the plug-in car grant. Why won't he match Scotland's ambition on car use? And how does he think he will meet his EV targets with poor charging infrastructure and reducing incentives without a scrappage scheme, whilst a substantial price gap between petrol and diesel cars and zero-emission cars remains? On buses, the pledge on 4,000 new buses represents only a tenth of the English fleet. And even now, the Zebra scheme is finally in place. Progress is glacial. In contrast, Scotland plans to remove half of its diesel fleet by 2023 and has the equivalent of over 2,700 buses already on order. Will it confirm when 4,000 buses will actually be delivered under the current scheme and when the next scheme will begin? The Secretary of State aims to decarbonise rail in England by 2050. That's 15 years after Scotland aims to. Scotland has led the way in a programme of rolling electrification. The Transport Select Committee recommended a similar programme for England. So will it commit to such a programme matching Scotland's pace? And if so, when will the first schemes be announced? And on decarbonising the maritime sector, there is only lip service. But I will try and end on consensus with aviation, something which we agree is difficult, and in which hydrogen alongside SAFs will play a leading role. Again, Scotland leads the way with government investment in decarbonisation programmes with plans for battery electric and hydrogen test flights, working with partners such as Zero Avia and Loganair as part of our ambition to make the Highlands and Islands the world's first zero-emission aviation region by 2040. We have a leading position in hydrogen aviation technology. We must increase investment to ensure we stay that way.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm always keen to work across the House wherever we agree on that last point on aviation and indeed on the number of car chargers in Scotland. This is all very good. What I can't understand is why the Honourable Gentleman is both talking about the success of a car charger rollout whilst being anti-car and actually saying that he doesn't want people to use the car, even electric vehicles, which are green. I don't understand how he can be proud of both points at the same time. But the main point,